Hello there, love. And to the American audience, welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD, degenerates, degeneritas, and esteemed members of the degenerati. This is now UFC 304, Edwards versus Muhammad 2, also featuring Aspinall versus Blaydes 2. So we have a pair of rematches with respective heavyweight and welterweight titles on the line. My busiest card of the year. I've got 12 picks, 12 men's fights featuring fighters that have at least competed in the UFC once previously, and I'm not staying away from a single one, which is very atypical of me. If you've followed my selections in and out, I've got a pick on every single fight on this card concerning the men within the stipulations I just outlined. I've got no opinion on Shauna Bannon versus the TikTok girl, nor Bruna Brazil versus Meatball Molly. I'll be hoping Molly wins, but it looks like she's a nearly 4-1 favorite, so people are kind of writing off Miss Brazil as it stands. Anyway, before jumping into all 12 of these picks, let me remind you, first of all, to please like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and YouTube if you haven't already. It goes a long way. I'd appreciate it very much. It would be nice to get to at least 100 YouTube subscribers by the end of the year, but we'll see how that goes. I also want to recap briefly last week's card. UFC Fight Night, Jana Droba versus Yemos. Forgive me. Like I said, not quite capping the women's fights yet, even though I'm a big Jana Droba fan. Also want to try. And it's funny because again, I say this every card at this point, or every show that I've done for these pay-per-views, but I am gonna make a deliberate effort to go a bit shorter on these fights, just because I've got 12 picks, and I don't want this show to be creeping out to like 3 hours or something. So I am gonna try to keep every single one of these breakdowns between 5 and 10 minutes, with the exception of maybe some of the main card fights I've got a little bit more opinions on. But I am going to try to keep this show somewhere in the realm of like 2 hours, 2.5. If I get out anything further than that, I'll be disappointed with myself. But of course, I say that before I actually get into the fights, and then, this is inevitably going to go long, so forgive me if it does. But before we get into the actual fights, I just want to speak really quickly on last week's event. Because it was pretty disappointing, at least relative to, what's happened the last two cards. I mean, the truth is, if you've been following this year, pretty closely, I don't think I've made an outright profit on a single fight night event, which is shameful and, I don't want to say embarrassing to admit. I think there's been a little bit of, unfortunate circumstance involved, because I've had pretty good reads, throughout the year. It's just that a lot of these spots that I invest confidence into as favorites, I'll usually end up getting 2 of 3, but will also, in almost every case this year, have had one that has just kind of come up short in disappointing fashion. At UFC Denver, it was Josh Van, and if Josh Van had found a way to grind out a split decision by winning that third round instead of getting knocked out, or if he had been correctly, in my opinion, my biased opinion obviously, awarded the first 2 rounds of his fight with Charles Johnson, I would have only missed the Angelusa fight against Gabriel Bonfim, and I would have gone 3 for 4 on underdogs that night. And I'm like 7-1, I think, on my last 8 underdog picks, or 6-1, something like that. And I've hit, my last, I've hit the last 3 at least. And not including the Lusa pick, I've actually hit my last 6. So I've had, very good reads lately, at least with the underdogs. But last week we had a rare spot in which I came up short picking 3 favorites. But what was more disappointing last week was losing the Junyong Park fight after weigh-ins, in which he, appeared happy and smiling on the scale, and certainly did not look like, compared to some other people that weighed in, that he was going to miss or be declared medically ineligible to compete under any circumstance. And that was the 9th co-main event over the last 5 UFC cards that has ended up getting canceled. So it was a pretty big disappointment, not only for fight fans, but also for the betting community. There were a lot of people that I think were very squarely on Park last week. He's been one of my favorite fighters to consistently bet on. I thought that he should have gotten the decision over Andre Muniz, although, again, obviously I was biased in that circumstance because I did make him a parlay leg that night, and it ended up costing me profit at that event too. But Park was my most confident pick last week, and to lose him after he had weighed in was pretty devastating. And then to make matters worse, for whatever reason, I try to exclusively just use bet online odds for the sake of making the most accessible parlays possible to everybody in the world, because, depending on what state you're in America, you may not necessarily have access to FanDuel or DraftKings or BetMGM or the major books. So since BetOnline is kind of effectively the book of the world, I try to use their odds with respect to communicating leans and picks during the week, as well as building parlays that are constructed with the most basic bets possible, as opposed to prop parlays that may not be available for people playing with other books. For whatever reason last week, you couldn't bet on a fight involving someone with the name Cody the Friday that weigh-ins happened. This is an inconsistent problem that I've encountered with BetOnline throughout my history using them to build parlays. One of the more bizarre examples I can remember was, or at least the first time I encountered it, was when Jordan Wright fought Marc-Andre Barriault 2 years ago. And I can't remember if that fight came together as a replacement or a short notice event, but I thought it might have had something to do with that in terms of why they weren't allowing it for parlay betting. And I was very, very confident in Jordan Wright in that case, and that ended up being the wrong read. So I ended up getting kind of saved by from my own bad read in that case. But it was something that I remember reaching out to their support team about, saying, I can understand if you don't want to allow a fight to be eligible for your parlay, because it's, the discretion of the book, and I can respect that as someone, that's playing there. But it would be nice if you would at least provide some context for why that's not the case. And they still don't do that, and they never really made a point, even though they typical customer service coaxing or let down. They'll say, okay, we'll take it into consideration, but then they don't end up really doing anything. Never clarified last week why Cody Gibson's fight with Brian Kelleher and Cody Durden's fight with Bruno Silva weren't eligible for parlay betting the day before the event. I decided to check again the day of, 24 hours later, and they had in fact been enabled. So I don't know if someone was just asleep at the wheel at the book or what have you, but that ended up being very, very disappointing because the one of the 3.5 unit parlays that I planned to put out last week was going to be the combination of Junyoung Park, Cody Gibson, and Steve Garcia, and I was planning on hedging on Gibson with probably Bill Algeo. So the Algeo one wouldn't have hit, but Gibson, Garcia, Park. I mean, I know Park didn't end up getting medically cleared, but he was my most confident pick of the card, and really is only it hasn't even really let me down himself as much as getting let down by the judges. I have to imagine that had Park gone into that fight with medical clearance, he would have gotten the win. So to lose what was going to be what was my most confident pick last week, and then have 2 fights out of the 8 picks I had remaining not eligible for betting on the day that I put my bets in, I was in a position where I thought I should probably just not bet this event at all. But I decided, you know what, I've been on a pretty good, my reads lately have been pretty good. I think I should just roll with it. And, even though I'm not expecting to hit on all of my favorites, I think that hopefully at least one of the 2 that I'm hedging on will go through. I didn't want to make Zhang Yang Li a parlay leg, but I, again, with only really like 5 picks to play from relative to favorites, I didn't have much to choose from. And so it was, I wasn't super confident in Kanan Khrushchevsky either, but I was pretty confident in Bill Algeo, and he's been a difficult fighter to cap. I was also extremely confident against when he fought Kyle Nelson, and that was a pretty big letdown spot too, for that to be his first loss by knockout in a fight where he didn't even drop to his knees in the way that he ended up doing in this Doo Ho Choi fight, a fight in which he won the first round on 2 judges' scorecards and seemed to be doing better relative to volume in the second round before Choi opened up a cut on his eye, and then Choi obviously had the power advantage. Algeo's defense is a little too awkward for his own good. He gets caught. The speculation is he broke his orbital, which is why he reacted as sharply as he did. But yeah, it's tough for me to take away a lot from what happened in those 3 fights. In the case of Algeo, I think with these back-to-back knockout losses and him being 35, you're going to have to watch his damage tolerance sharply going forward, because it might be in a position now where you can't really even feel comfortable playing him as a favorite anymore, maybe as an underdog. It was the way that he reacted to that punch from Choi was just not encouraging for the remainder of his career by any means. You don't really see often, particularly a fighter that's only been knocked out once, even if it was their most previous fight, to just outright kind of, extend their arm in terms of no mas and call off the fight themselves. And a lot of people say Algeo must have shattered his orbital from that punch because it, he's a tough guy and he wouldn't do that under other circumstances. But he is 35 and getting up there. And you wonder, after back-to-back knockout losses, and given how awkward of a style he has defensively, how much that's going to hold up going forward. So Algeo, I faded him against Alexander Hernandez. I didn't get rewarded in that circumstance. I had Andre Fili graded to beat him just barely, and in that case I decided to hedge on rounds and was rewarded for that. But I believe Algeo beat Fili by like split decision, if memory serves correctly. But obviously, I faded him against Hernandez, and that played out horribly, even though Hernandez was the underdog in that circumstance. And I deployed him as a parlay leg both last week, even though I wanted to hedge on him originally with Cody Gibson at a similar price to where he was against Duho Choi. I also faded him against TJ Brown. So he lost the split decision to Andre Fili. So I actually could have played Fili as a favorite in that case, but I think Fili might have been more than, in the 200 range or lower in that case. Memory, I'm not quite sure, remembering offhand. But it, my reads with Aljo just haven't been super accurate of late. And so he's kind of in a position with him now at this point where he might be on the no-fly list. Aljo Fili was a pick'em, so I could have played Fili, as the favorite in that case, but I'm glad that I hedged on rounds in that case. It ended up being the correct read. So it was I had a higher opinion of TJ Brown than I should have, even though I'm pretty sure Brown was the underdog in that fight and lost. I did end up fading TJ Brown against Darren Elkins, and Elkins was the underdog in that fight, so I kind of corrected it there. But yeah, this is 4 bad reads on Aljo fights I've had in a row, and at this point you kind of just have to recognize when you don't really have a sharp account of a fighter, and should probably just end up staying away from the going forward. So I don't really know what to make of Aljo at this point, especially as he's getting into the declining stage of his career. Might consider him as an underdog again, but otherwise probably just worth staying away from. I don't have much to say about the Krzyzewski fight, just because it kind of played out exactly how I said it was going to play out in the event that Krzyzewski lost, which was that Halabah's the harder hitter and throws a more volume, and that if Krzyzewski goes to the ground, he's going to win pretty handily. Krzyzewski got the last round on 2 of the judges' scorecards because he was initiating those. He shot and landed multiple takedowns, and Halabah's resistance wasn't really there in terms of the takedown defense by the end of the fight, even though I think Halabah kind of turned the tables going into like the last minute or so. Krzyzewski made enough of an impression over the first part of the round to get that on 2 judges' scorecards. First round was nearly dead even on significant strikes. I think Halabah ended up with like 2 more than Krzyzewski did, but Krzyzewski spent too much time trading with somebody that threw harder than him and paid for it. I don't want to subscribe to the theory that Halabah's kid might have had an impression on the judges, but it was pretty annoying to hear that kid screaming the whole time, knowing that Halabah was probably going to get rewarded more for the shots that he was landing than whatever Krzyzewski was putting out against an opponent that's never been knocked out. So that was unfortunate. It's crazy how many underdogs hit last week. Pretty sure Peterson, Ogden, Hyder Emil, Duho Choi, and Halabah, and Bruno Silva. So I mean that's 6 underdogs. I mean that's a crazy total, for the amount of fights that were on this card. I think it speaks to how volatile a lot of these Apex cards can be, but I don't want to make excuses for these fight nights or whatever. I've got to get a winning one on my docket for this year before I effectively talk my shit. So last note, Zhang Yang, Lee, Hyder Emil. I mean, Lee's probably going to regret playing right into what Emil wanted, especially after how much more technical he had played in his previous fights. But yeah, obviously it's never a good sign when you see a fighter tend, to try to lean on their chin as hard as he did. His head defense had been so much better in his previous fight against Blake Bilder. I mean, Bilder landed only 3 significant head strikes on 27 attempts. I mean, that you just don't see that very often for a fight that stays standing as long as that one did for 15 minutes. So he was much more measured in his previous opponent. I expected that to kind of be the case against Emil, given the danger Emil presented on the feet and the volume he was going to try to land. But, you know, full credit to Emil for going out there and offering what was one of the more exciting fights inside of 90 seconds I think you're going to see. Lee definitely rocked him. There was one point where Emil's eyes kind of rolled back on one of the counters that he landed, but obviously Emil hung tough, has never lost, period, let alone been knocked out or finished, and just kind of overwhelmed Zhang Yang Lee with volume. And I didn't want to lean on Zhang Yang Lee as one of my favorites last week because of what happened, or just because I knew the sample size was small for both of these guys. But after the Zhang Yang Park fight fell apart, I was kind of, you know, caught between a rock and a hard place. So I should have gone with my original plan of deploying Gibson, but again, I couldn't play Gibson the day that I, you know, put out the 3-leg parlays, and so I was kind of forced into a corner of using a combination of Aljo, Lee, and Khrushchevsky, and really only getting to retain Steve Garcia as my most confident pick other than Zhang Yang Park. So it was frustrating, especially after going 2 for 2 on underdogs, although I'm not going to gloat about the Bruno Silva result because obviously Durden was getting the better of him in that fight until the power for Silva provided the equalizer. So I'm much more happy with how the Ogden fight played out, I'll just say that. But that's enough speaking on the previous event as well as just kind of recent history. We've got a ton of fights to get into, and I did say I was going to try to keep this shorter relative to other shows, or at least the breakdowns for each of these shorter. So let's get right into it with the first fight. There's been a recent shuffling on the bout order, at least according to ESPN, so I'm not necessarily going to be doing this in the order in which I put picks out, but we will begin with Mick Parkin and Lukasz Brzeski. Parkin enters 9-0, last fought at UFC Fight Night Rebus Namajunas towards the end of March, where he defeated Muhammad Usman by unanimous decision, who himself fought the previous weekend against Thomas Peterson and lost in even more resounding fashion than how Parkin defeated him. Parkin got hurt a little bit early in that first round and had to outpoint Usman for the final 10 minutes in that one. I do believe I made Parkin a parlay leg at that event back in March. Brzeski last fought a couple weeks after that at Fight Night Allen versus Curtis 2 towards the beginning of April, where he took on newcomer Walter Walker, the brother of Johnny Walker. He was a pretty significant underdog in that fight and ended up winning by unanimous decision. It's been an interesting career for Brzeski, who enters 10-4-1, was on a 3-fight losing streak, probably fighting for his job the last time out, and ended up saving it. And it was the first win that Brzeski has had since his controversial submission victory on Dana White's Contender Series. So this is, I think, a more interesting fight than the line would imply that it is. I think this is this is an example of a line that is, I don't think that it's necessarily wide. I think that it is pretty appropriately priced, but I am surprised that it is lined in the fashion that it is, just given Parkin's recent performances and the fact that Brzeski is coming off of a win. And I have to wonder if the UK public weren't as invested in betting on this card as they are because it's in Manchester, if Parkin would be as blown out on this line as he currently is, despite the fact that I do think the price that he currently sits at, or at least the one that I put him out for, is an appropriate one. He's starting to get a little bit up there towards 300. At that point, I would be more cautious about playing him, just because we haven't seen any knockouts from him yet in the UFC, which is kind of atypical for a heavyweight, although he's shown good, well-rounded skills. The more we kind of know what we're going to get from Parkin. He has shown good, well-rounded ability, just not a great sense of urgency, but he's shown, as the Usman fight proved, he can rally a bit from after he's taken a bit of damage and make adjustments that allow him to swing a fight back in his favor. The problem is, obviously, Usman has not really shown any sort of sophisticated strategy himself in high-level MMA. So against an opponent that is also able to make changes and adjust, you wonder how much more formidable another opponent is going to be. The last time that he fought in the UK, it was at Fight Night Aspinall Tybura, and I put out a ton of underdog picks for that fight night. I had Parkin graded to beat Pogues, but I decided to make that a stay away just because I didn't think the sample size on him was big enough yet. And of course, if I had put him out, he would have been my only underdog of like the 5 or 6 I think I put out on that card to hit that night. So that was disappointing event, even though I did make profit on it, and that was part of the big streak that I was on. Particularly the extremely fortunate July that I had a year ago. But Pogues, again, was a guy that wasn't really going to be someone that... It looked like his heart had been kind of taken out of that fight, in a sense, before it even started. I faded Parkin against Caio Machado, and I thought Machado had a pretty decent argument for getting a split decision. It was surprising to see him get a unanimous one. And when I speak on promo push, there's an element to it that involves not only whether a fighter has appeared on previous main events for the UFC or if they fought on Dana White's Contender Series, but there's another added benefit when you're talking about a fighter that is entering with an undefeated record. It's easier for the UFC to sell guys that are undefeated than ones that have even just one loss in the win column. And I think that is reflected in how feverishly Dana White has attempted over the years to get the disqualification loss on John Jones's record overturned, or at least transitioned into a no contest, which will be interesting to see what happens given the recent development that 12-6 elbows are now legal, according to a recent rule change for the Nevada State Athletic Commission, I believe. So, but that's another topic for another time. My point here is, I think that the UFC usually would prefer to uphold a fighter's undefeated record for the sake of making them more marketable than take it away in controversial fashion. Which is why, even if this fight with Brzeski ends up being close, between the fact that it's in England and the fact that Parkin is still undefeated at this point, I can't imagine a close decision going Brzeski's way. And he's already had a history of having close decisions that would have upended an otherwise undefeated fighter's record not go his way. In that sense, I'm referencing the Martin Boudet fight, and forgive me, Boudet wasn't actually undefeated at that point, but he was 2-0 in the UFC and on a pretty significant winning streak. So a lot of people thought that he should have gotten the decision against Boudet. He got 30-26 against Carl Williams and then suffered a pretty bad knockout against Waldo Cortez Acosta. And it's interesting comparing his picture on, I believe it was Tapology, or if you've seen, when he just looked to be in much better shape for his Dana White Contender Series fight, or some of his promotional pictures, compared to the shape he came into against Carl Williams or against Waldo Cortez Acosta or Martin Buday. I mean, it really is a night and day silhouette relative to what we had seen previously. Granted, he looked to be in better shape against Walter Walker, and I think that's part of the reason that he got the win. But you don't necessarily know what version of Brzeski you're going to get, and it'll be interesting to see which one shows up at the scale this week, given he's presumably no longer fighting for his job in the same way he was when he was on a 3-fight losing streak, and the fact that he's going to be facing some adversity here in the form of going into unfriendly territory against an undefeated fighter that's going to have the crowd on their side. In terms of a pure technical look between these two, I think the striking is fairly even, but I might lean a little bit more towards Brzeski just because you would think that he would want to keep the fight in the stand-up, so he'd be able to operate a little more comfortably there, and we haven't really seen a big volume of kicks out of Parkin in the way that Brzeski has shown that he's more willing to throw. The concern, though, is obviously Brzeski's takedown defense is pretty dreadful, and it's on tape in terms of how a guy like Carl Williams was able to pretty consistently take advantage of it. Parkin hasn't really done a lot of volume shooting, but his own ground game has made the difference for him in the fight with Caio Machado. That was closer than, as I said, I thought it was closer than I thought otherwise got reflected on the scorecards. If he fights a well-rounded fight here, I think Parkin will cruise very easily, and that's what I expect to happen, because again, he is someone that has shown the ability to adjust well throughout his UFC career, but particularly in the last fight against Usman, where he got stung early, lost the first round because of it, but was able to rally back and win the last 10 minutes of that. So I think a 30-27 here for Parkin is the most likely outcome, but it wouldn't surprise me if this plays out similarly to Parkin's fight with Usman, where Brzeski kind of stings him a little bit early, and then Parkin's able to make it back to the corner, re-strategize, comes out shooting some takedowns in the second and third rounds, and is able to control the fight more on his terms to the end, to where he gets a 29-28. So give me Mick Parkin to stay undefeated, and I would like to deploy him as a parlay leg, but as I said, I like him in the 200 range, but he's starting to get out close to 300 at some of these books. He's currently 280 at BetOnline. He was, I think, around 240 when I put him out earlier this week, if memory serves correct. He was 254. So if he gets out further to 300, I'm probably going to have to look elsewhere. But for the time being, I do like him in the 200 range, and I would be surprised if he doesn't get a 30-27, but I do think a 29-28 is realistic if Brzeski's able to get some early damage on him. The next fight is Sam Patterson and Kiefer Crosbie. Patterson enters 11-2-1 after a quick submission of Johan Lioness at UFC 297 this past January. Crosbie enters 10-4 after getting submitted last year at UFC 293 Adesanya Strickland at the hands of Kevin Jousset. Jousset, however you say. In any event, this is going to be pretty quick. Patterson, obviously, the last time he fought in the UK, had a big letdown against Yanal Ashmouz. That was down a weight class for him when he was still a lightweight, and I think it was part of what prompted his move up to welterweight to try to kind of put some more resistance back into his chin. He was a pretty sizable favorite, I think, against Yanal Ashmouz a year ago at UFC 286. Ashmouz obviously made a big impression with a knockout inside of 90 seconds. I believe after catching one of Patterson's kicks. I don't really have much to say about this one just because we haven't gotten to see a ton of Patterson beyond his Contender Series appearance, and because we haven't even gotten to see a full round of Kiefer Crosbie yet. What I will say is, although I'm not saying Patterson is the same level of talent right now that Kevin Jousset is, when you purely just look at what their physical profile and their preferred paths to victory so far are, they're extremely similar, and because of that, I think you have to wonder how much resistance Crosby's going to be able to put up in this fight. Patterson has a lot of the similar size that Jousset does for welterweight. He was already one of the larger lightweights before he decided to move up. And he's going to be enjoying an 8-inch reach advantage here on top of a 6-year gap in age and 4 more inches of height that I think will allow him to stay measured, even though there are questions about him having tall man defense. We have not seen a lot of punching power from Kiefer Crosbie to where I think you have to be concerned about him kind of getting inside and being able to take advantage of Patterson's chin. Granted, he did knock out Cowboy Oliveira in his last fight before he got into the UFC, and he had a knockout win in the first 90 seconds of his fight prior to fighting Cowboy Oliveira. But both of those were the result of elbows rather than just straight punches. And he had not knocked out anybody in his MMA career after his 4th fight until those 2 results happened in the middle of July 2 years ago and then in April of last year. So there's people that are kind of openly questioning whether or not Crosby's really even UFC caliber to begin with. I would like to see him get, more, matchups where he's not dealing with as much of a discrepancy in size to kind of test that theory. Jousset's a tough first draw for your UFC debut. That might have even been a fill-in replacement spot in that case. And Patterson, I think, is a guy that the UFC really likes. Obviously, got a finish on Contender Series 2 years ago and was kind of, I think, given the last of Johan Lioness as a way to kind of prove that he can actually win against these power hitters up a weight class. So I think that they are trying to salvage Patterson a bit here. That's why they've brought him back on the UK card. And I would expect Patterson, given his more well-rounded skill set than what Crosbie has shown, and what Crosbie struggled against in the Jousset fight, I would think Patterson is probably going to find his own submission in this case. Now, he did, prior to Contender Series, he had only won by submission previously via guillotine. So I think that I would be a little bit wary of him jumping guillotine in this case against Crosbie just because of, getting put on the bottom, even though he does have the length to, I think, find a finish that way. And Crosbie does have 2 losses by submission in his career, both his last fight in Bellator and the fight that he just had most recently against Kevin Jousset. But he found rear naked chokes, I believe, in both of his 2 most recent victories, and I would hope that he follows a similar route to victory that Kevin Jousset did in getting a rear naked choke on Crosbie. So I do think that's how Patterson is going to win this. I'll say it happens in the first round. I wouldn't be surprised if this drags out a little bit later than that. I did put him out at 350. I think that 300 range is a good price for him. Unfortunately, even though I still see him hanging around in that 350, 360 range at a lot of other books, he's since blown out to minus 420 at Bet Online, and I don't think I'm going to be comfortable playing him at that price. So I'm hoping that it comes down a little bit back into the 300 range if I do want to include him in any parlays. But I do think this is set up to be a, if not necessarily a bounce back spot, given the win that he had over Lioness, at least a bounce back at home spot relative to what happened when he fought Eshmuz at UFC 286 last year, to kind of help him save some face with his local fans. So give me Sam Patterson by first round submission. The next fight is Muhammad Mokaev and Manel Kape. Mokaev is undefeated at 12-0 after defeating Alex Perez at UFC Fight Night Rosenstrike versus Gaziv at the beginning of March of this year. Manel Kape enters 19-6 on a 4-fight winning streak in the UFC, but has not fought since UFC 293 at the beginning of last September, when he defeated Felipe Dos Santos by unanimous decision. This has been a fight that a lot of people have been looking forward to for a while. It remains to be seen if Manel Kape makes weight for it. There's a lot of people that are spooked by the fact that this fight went from being on the main card last week to unceremoniously demoted to the main prelim at the expense of elevating Christian Leroy Duncan versus Gregory Rodriguez to the main card. The UFC didn't really clarify when they announced that during last week's fight night what was going on with Mokaev Kape, before confirming later through a graphic, I think, that it was going to be the featured prelim, and it has since gone from being on the main card to the featured prelim to now the 4th overall fight of the evening, not even the main early prelim, according to the bout order on ESPN. Now, there's a million reasons you can speculate why that's the case. My going theory is that they are kind of openly worried that Kape is going to miss weight again in a way that jeopardizes this fight, which is why they've decided to put it on the early prelims in a way that keeps it from being, outright an embarrassment that they lose a main fight card or a main fight on the card within 24 hours. But we'll see what else happens. As for how this matchup goes, I thought that it being a pick'em was very appropriate throughout the week, and I see it starting to get more and more in favor of Mokaev, which I can understand because I've got a very, very solid grade on him here. But what I will say is there's, something relative to my analysis and then just something relative to how I think people are interpreting this fight. One thing that I'm going to be monitoring going forward is that even though I tend to be the believer that the biggest variable you have to account for in any fight is the age gap, if it exists, I have noticed that in a lot of cases where there is an age gap, most of the time when you see the older fighter winning, it's because that fighter isn't necessarily in the decline of their career yet. They're still either in their prime or entering their prime or on their way out of their prime, but they haven't reached that definitive decline stage of 35 or older yet. And the younger fighter is, they haven't quite even reached their prime years yet of, somewhere in the range of 28 and 33. They're still in the years where they're developing their skills, and because of that, you can tend to overrate the age gap if one exists. I think the most brilliant recent example that I have of that is the Joshua Van-Charles Johnson fight, in which Van, I think, had something like an 11-year age gap, but because Johnson wasn't in the decline stage at all and is arguably in the prime of his career right now, especially coming off of that win, you have to discount how much the age gap plays a factor there of, 10 or 11 years, more so than you would if, like a 38-year-old were fighting a 28-year-old. when the younger fighter is not in the prime years of their career yet, you can still, because of the long-term trend, I think, make that a pro point for the younger fighter winning, but you cannot give it the bump in rating that you would in the event that the gap is wider than 5 years, in the same way that you would if that older fighter were in the very late stages of their 30s and the younger fighter were in those prime age, in that age range that I just alluded to. So that's something that I tried to keep in mind when evaluating the Mokaev-Kape fight, because Kape is only 30 and Mokaev is only 23 and will be turning 24 a week from the day that I'm recording this today. But the age gap, obviously, in this case is not really as significant as it would be in other matchups, even though you can still make an argument based on the long-term trend that the younger fighter should come out victorious. So that's one angle that I think, just in terms of people that are looking at pure stats, that kind of needs to be accounted for, and something I'm going to be looking at going forward. But the other thing, too, is that there's a lot of people that I think are saying that, you know, the ones that are very, very confident in Mokaev, I'm a big believer in the idea that when you've got the striker versus grappler matchup, that you typically want to go with the fighter that is offering more to their opponent in the area that they're weaker in. So, you know, if the striker has a better, you know, shot of resisting takedowns or defending submissions than what the grappler is able to provide in terms of their own striking, then in that case you should go with the striker. I do think that the people that are confident in Mokaev here are a little bit overconfident in terms of where he's at as a striker than what would merit him kind of retaining the confidence that a lot of people seem to have. If this fight stays standing for 15 minutes and Mokaev isn't able to take down Kape in a purely hypothetical context, I think Kape is going to absolutely crush Mokaev. Mokaev looked totally lost against Perez, to the point that he was like shooting some very, very bad body language takedowns in the later half of that fight, and needed to make enough of an impression in the final round to win, and was able to do so, but was very, very clearly selling out to get that fight on the ground in a way that he was just not interested in entertaining Perez on the feet. I have to imagine that if this fight is close going into the final round, that a similar thing is going to take place. And Kape offers a lot of the similar, not necessarily sophisticated combos that Perez does, but punching power is obviously there. And the guy is still, in terms of volume, much further along in terms of putting together strikes and consistently displaying output than what we have seen from Mokaev on the feet. Mokaev has had more concerning performances than I think people are willing to admit. If he didn't submit Tim Elliott in the final round of their fight at UFC 294, he was going to lose that fight on the scorecards. Yafel Filho probably should have submitted him in a way that Mokaev just kind of exhibited otherworldly resistance to pain, and despite having his leg nearly obliterated, was able to rally back and find a late submission in that one. I don't want to say he played with his food against Malcolm Gordon, but given how many other worse fighters than Mokaev were able to finish Gordon in faster fashion than what he did, I think his performance there can be kind of rightfully stated as disappointing. his UFC debut against Cody Durden was obviously spectacular, but was a little bit of a meme, ending in less than a minute. And Charles Johnson, that win has aged reasonably well, but Johnson was a UFC debutant, possibly on short notice at the time of that fight too, as well. And it was, again, a fight that that Mokaev mostly won through just kind of more effectively chain wrestling in relentless fashion. Now, Kape, when he's had to face very credible threats on the ground, even in cases where that threat didn't get deployed, he has encountered some resistance. He's been submitted multiple times during his MMA career, although the last time it happened was back in 2017 in what was his third fight in Rizin. And his first two losses in the UFC have obviously aged very well. Alexander Pantoja, there's no shame in losing to the current champion. And there's people that would argue that he won the Mateus Nicolau fight, but Nicolau is still settled in as a pretty competent ranked flyweight in the time since. I think that if this, like I said, if this fight stays standing for 15 minutes in a hypothetical sense, the pick'em odds where this fight was earlier in this week are totally justified in terms of this looking very good for Kape. It's just a question of whether or not his takedown defense is going to hold up. And I don't think that it does. I think that Mokaev, the commitment to chain wrestling and the youthful athleticism is going to get him over the hump here. He'll have the crowd in his favor. Kape has kind of made himself into a villain where I think that if him missing weight, assuming the fight even takes place after he would miss weight takes place, that he's only going to incur even more boos from this crowd than he would have gotten otherwise. But this is a potential spot for Mokaev to make a big statement if he is able to find a submission here. I don't think that he's going to. I think that Kape's submission defense is going to hold up. But I would expect Mokaev to win the first two rounds and at least get a 29-28 here, and then maybe kind of spend the last round enduring an onslaught from Kape, as Kape knows he's kind of got to sell out for a finish. Kape's able to deal more damage in a way that gets him the final round, but by then he's already dropped the first two rounds in a way that Mokaev has just more effectively out-wrestled and out-grappled him while threatening submissions. And I would expect Mokaev to get a 29-28 decision here. However, like I said, I think that the striking here, the discrepancy is much starker than Mokaev bettors want to admit it is. And if Mokaev isn't looking to immediately bring this to the ground in the first round as he should, I'm going to be concerned with, how he game plans for the rounds afterwards. But his game plan has always included wrestling at this point. I expect his striking to improve as he gets older into his MMA career, but for where he is right now, he just needs to lean on the skills that got him here, and I would hope that he does that from the early jump, and I think he does. So give me Mokaev to win a 29-28 decision, but if he's able to have, force Kape into making a mistake early, I don't think it's out of the question that he could find a submission either. The next fight and featured early prelim is Oban, Elliott, and Preston Parsons. Parsons enters 11-4 after a unanimous decision win over Matthew Semmelsberger at the first UFC event of the year, Fight Night Ankalaev versus Walker 2. Elliott enters after taking down Val Woodburn by unanimous decision at UFC 298. Which remains my most profitable event this year. Elliott was a fighter that I picked to win, I think, at pretty significant odds against Val Woodburn. Although that might have been a stay away for me upon reflection. I'm not quite sure, but In any event, I did have Elliott graded to win that, and he outside of. It was interesting. That fight was one of the rare instances where a fighter earns a majority 30-27, and I say majority relative to at least two of the three judges giving a 30-27, despite the fact that Woodburn had a knockdown in one of the rounds. It was early enough that Elliott was able to make a strong enough impression and come back over the rest of the round that he was able to earn it back in the eyes of two judges, which in the era of damage being the lead criteria is not something that you see particularly often. Usually if a knockdown happens, unless the fighter is able to come back and earn a knockdown of their own, that'll be enough to get the fighter that earned the knockdown the round, regardless of what else takes place or how early it happens. So that was an interesting bit to see. And it kind of proved that Elliott, even though he's been knocked out multiple times already in his career and encountered even some chinny turbulence, if you will, on his Contender Series appearance, he's a tough guy and a grinder that will do what he has to do to grind out a victorious result. Now, you can say Parsons is a grinder too. He's definitely shown a good blend of wrestling and grappling during his UFC career, which goes a long way. But I don't think his stand-up is as good as a lot of people that are picking him as a favorite this week it would justify him being a strong favorite here. And the line over the week has closed a little bit as it gets closer and closer. I don't know if the Welsh audience and the money from Wales is starting to come in as the week goes along, but I do think that Elliott is going to have an advantage in terms of volume of strikes here. And he's also, for however bad his chin is, or at least is perceived to be relative to the damage he's suffered in his two UFC and Dana White's Contender Series appearances, Elliott's never been knocked out before the final minute of the second round, where Parsons, prior getting to the UFC, in his first UFC fight, he suffered a first-round knockout to Daniel Rodriguez. But even prior to that, in his third ever MMA appearance, he got knocked out in the first round by Mike Perry. So Parsons definitely has, I think, the worst damage tolerance here. And I think it speaks to why he so feverishly tries to get fights on the ground. Kind of reminds me of like a welterweight Pat Sabatini in a lot of ways, where the wrestling and the grappling game and the athleticism are all very impressive, but just doesn't really have the sophisticated stand-up to, I think, get to the upper echelon of the division that he's going to be fighting in. And that's reflected in the fact that he has no knockout wins in his MMA career, which is very uncommon for a fighter that is able to make it to the UFC. The most brilliant example I can recall was Renato Moicano prior to his fight with Jalen Turner. But even in that case, Moicano had several instances where he was opting to go for club and subs as opposed to finishing fights with ground and pound. So Parsons hasn't even been able to... I don't really think... I don't know how many of Parsons' previous results that ended up as submission wins may have been the result of a club and sub, but the fact that he hasn't even achieved a submission win in the UFC event or in the UFC yet, I think is a reflection of the fact that in most of those cases it was probably not him getting knockdowns and then turning those into submission opportunities. I enjoy very much listening to the Sherdog podcast featuring Ben Duffy and Keith Schillian. at the beginning of every fight week, especially after I've completed all of my analysis, just to kind of compare to what two of the more prominent journalists doing this that have a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of recent fight results, such as the one that I've tried to put together, just, getting a sense of where their opinion is, even though they don't consider themselves a betting show. There were two things that Duffy said about Parsons this week that really surprised me, which were, one, were that he thought the wins over Evan Elder and Semmelsberger were impressive enough in the sense that both of those guys might be top 25 welterweights. I think that's a gross overestimation of Semmelsberger's abilities, given how many letdown results that guy has had. And I speak to that as someone that has bet him in a lot of spots before and been let down, but also tried fading him in other spots. And Evan Elder's a lightweight. He's not even really a true welterweight, and I don't think that Elder's... I mean, he fought at welterweight at short notice against Darius Flowers, but I don't think you can call the guy a top 25 welterweight just because he beat Darius Flowers on short notice up a weight class. And I also think that the fight against Elder was taking that on short notice, which is why he fought it at welterweight against Parsons as well. Really the best result I think that he had was nearly getting a split decision win over Trevin Giles in a fight that I faded him against. And that was when Giles had, I think, a bit more stock in his, or had a loftier stock in terms of how much he had left despite moving down a weight class that has since been taken away after his loss to Carlos Prates, even though he was quite arguably winning that fight against Prates up until Prates was able to catch him and knock him out in the second round. Duffy also thinks that this could be the first knockout win of Preston Parsons' MMA career against Oban Elliott, which, again, it's for a guy that hasn't gotten a knockout win yet, you would think is... You just have to wonder if he's really got the punching power and the volume to take advantage of a guy like Elliott at this level, given that he hasn't demonstrated it against any of his other previous matchups, particularly when he fought a guy like Trevin Giles, who arguably is even chinnier than Oban Elliott is. So I think Elliott's going to be able to handle Parsons on the feet much more than I think the people betting Parsons would expect. And if it does stay on the feet, I do like Elliott to win as an underdog. I think that both of these guys have shown to be pretty good wrestlers to where they can probably give themselves a bit of resistance if it goes in either one of those directions. Elliott's never been submitted, so I would expect his submission defense to be good even if Parsons ends up taking his back and putting him in a precarious position. But yeah, if there is going to be a finish for Parsons here, I think it's more likely that it's a submission than a knockout. And I do expect Elliott, given the own effectiveness he's shown in his own wrestling, to provide more resistance to what Parsons is offering than what a lot of people picking Parsons to win are expecting. And I think that, because Elliott is going to be the more local guy, not necessarily an England, Manchester guy, but is in Wales, so is at least on the same island of the kingdom, the fans are going to be more firmly in his corner than Parsons, and I think are going to be supporting Elliott's moments of success on the feet. And I would expect that he has at least enough of them, while Parsons is maybe panic wrestling a bit, trying to get this fight into where he feels more comfortable to make a bigger impression with damage between striking and the crowd and get a 29-28 upset win. So give me Oban Elliott to win by, I'll say it's a split decision, but I wouldn't surprise if it's 29-28 outright unanimous. But I like him here to get the upset win. He's won 5 decisions in a row, so why not make it 6? And he has yet to lose going the distance in his MMA career. So if he is able to drag it out that late, I like him to get it done. So give me Oban Elliott to win by split decision. The next fight is Modestas Bukauskas and Marcin Prachnio. Bukauskas enters 15-6. Last appearance was Fight Night Almeida Lewis, where he got knocked out by Vitor Petrino at the start of November of last year. This is his second stint in the UFC. He previously, prior to that knockout loss, beat Tyson Pedro by unanimous decision at UFC 284 and followed that up last June, or in June of 2023 rather, with a unanimous decision win over Zach Pauga. Prachnio, conversely, was last seen earlier this year at Fight Night Hermanson Pfeiffer, where he took down Devin Clark by unanimous decision in a fight where Clark was a 2-1 underdog. And I picked him. One of the worst picks I've made this year. A lot of people have correctly labeled this as a pretty low-level fight, which is why it was appropriate at the top of the week that it was starting off the entire card. At least according to the bout order on ESPN, it has since been elevated to the regular prelims, starting off there. I do think that there are better candidates for being on the prelims than this fight, I'll say that. I thought it was pretty appropriately slotted. I'm surprised that it has now risen to the area that it is. The key thing I think that you need to remember in just evaluating the recent performances of these two is that Prachnio's last two wins have been the result of fighting fighters that have done next to nothing while in the octagon with him. I picked William Knight as an underdog. Well, I should go back even further than that, because I haven't had a great record picking either of these guys in terms of grading them. Bukauskas better, so I'm 2-1 in grading his last three appearances, but Prachnio is someone that's been kind of difficult for me to figure out. I picked him as one of my main parlay legs about a month before I started MMA Rax as a favorite over Felipe Lins, and Lins, having shown no interest in grappling in any of his prior appearances, proceeded to cage clinch and take down Prachnio in a way that resulted in a unanimous decision loss for Mr. Marcin. So when he didn't fight for almost a year and returned against William Knight, I felt optimistic about taking a shot on William Knight. And that fight ended with Knight attempting, not landing, attempting only 33 total strikes in a fight that was stand-up for 15 minutes. 33 total strike attempts in 15 minutes. So that's barely over 2 attempts per minute from William Knight, just to give you a sense of how little he did in that fight. Knight didn't land a single shot to the head, and he landed, of the 8 strikes that he did land in the fight, 6 of them were leg kicks. And Prachnio landed 79 significant strikes, 79 total strikes. 63 of those were leg kicks. So Prachnio got that unanimous decision over William Knight doing almost nothing but low leg kicking, which is probably the best tool he has in his skill set, to be fair, and it is an effective one. But you would have to imagine that most fighters are going to provide a greater level of resistance than what Prachnio had to encounter in that one. Now, when Clark fought him earlier this year, Clark attempted 127 total strikes in 15 minutes. So Clark did try to do more, but the main reason Clark wasn't taken as a 2-1 favorite in that fight under the impression that he was going to outstrike Prachnio. The thinking was that because Prachnio had illustrated pretty poor takedown defense and a vulnerability to wrestling, particularly in the fight against Vitor Petrino. Clark, historically, someone that preferred to lean on wrestling, was going to have a pretty obvious path to victory. He didn't take it. He attempted only 2 takedowns in the entire fight, which was much less than I think he had in pretty much any of his previous UFC appearances. And Prachnio was able to capitalize on that and more than doubled him up on total strikes for that fight. What was particularly humiliating for Clark was that towards the end of the fight, Prachnio actually took him down, which I'm not even sure if Prachnio had attempted, let alone secured a takedown previously in his UFC career prior to that. He's almost entirely just a stand-up guy and someone who frankly likes to cheese on low leg kicks. Now, Bukauskas, we haven't really seen any interest in going to the ground from him either. As a matter of fact, he has not landed a takedown in either of his UFC runs. But he has shown better takedown defense than what Prachnio has. You still have to figure that this is going to be almost an entirely stand-up affair for however long it lasts. And I think there's a few things that make Bukauskas the rightful favorite here and why I do feel good about picking him as a favorite. Further than the fact that Prachnio's most recent wins in the UFC have been against fighters that either pursued completely incorrect game plans or just flat out didn't do anything for 15 minutes. Bukauskas has an age gap here. He's only 30 compared to Prachnio's 36. And he's also going to have a 4-inch reach advantage, which I do think is significant. On top of the fact that the only knockout that we've seen in the UFC from Prachnio was against Ike Villanueva, who was pretty old at that point. He's currently 40 years old, and his last appearance was against Tyson Pedro. Actually, on the same fight night, I believe, that he lost to Felipe Lins back in April of 2022. So Ike would have been, I think, just over 30, just past his 38th birthday at that point. So his only knockout when he fought Ike was, 35, or Ike would have been 37 years old at that point and was on his way out already. So it kind of already had his chin compromised. That was, in fact, at the time, the 6th knockout loss of his career. So he had already been knocked out twice previously in the UFC by Chase Sherman and Jordan Wright, just to give you an idea of what kind of level of competition we were talking about here and where that guy's chin was at. So I don't think Prachnio has necessarily proven himself to be a power striker, particularly at light heavyweight. Bukauskas, by comparison, in his Cage Warriors title fight before he started his second run in the UFC, got a one-punch knockout at the start of the 4th round against Chuck Campbell, who had, granted much lower level competition than I think most of the guys you're going to face in the UFC. But that was the first knockout loss of Campbell's MMA career. A guy fighting out of AKA, one of the best gyms in the world, at least. So I think that Bukauskas is pretty noticeably the harder hitter between these two, at least relative to punches. If Prachnio is going to win this fight, he's going to have to just get way ahead on low leg kicks in a way that takes Bukauskas's ability to manage distance out from him immediately. And I don't really see that happening. The other thing with Prachnio, and both of these guys have been knocked out 4 times in their MMA careers and submitted once. Submission isn't a big factor here. And granted, Bukauskas, I think, in recent years has been knocked out much more recently than Prachnio has. But Prachnio started his UFC career with 3 straight first-round knockouts. The first of which came to Sam Alvey, and the last of which was to Mike Rodriguez, sandwiched by a knockout from Magomed Ankalaev. So there is attrition here that he's been able to overcome in his more recent appearances that hasn't necessarily caught up with him in a way that has resulted in him getting knocked out again. I don't know if Bukauskas is going to be the guy to finish him, but what I will say is both of these guys have pretty similar experience going the distance, and if it does go the distance, Bukauskas has only ever lost a decision in a split. Everybody else that's ever beaten him has had to either knock him out or submit him, and his split decision loss came to Mikhail Oleksiejczuk, who's still fighting in the UFC, and that would have happened when Oleksiejczuk was on his light heavyweight run. So, by comparison, Prachnio lost a unanimous decision to Felipe Lins, and he also lost a unanimous decision in his third ever MMA fight back in 2014. The guy is proven to be not as effective of a fighter going the distance as Bukauskas has. So I have to think that if this fight does go the distance, if it is maybe 1-1 going into the third, you have to like what Bukauskas is going to do in the final round versus what Prachnio is shown to do historically. So between the age gap, the reach advantage, the power advantage, and the history of final round performance, I really do like Bukauskas here. I do see him getting a 29-28 unanimous decision, but it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up, catching Prachnio at some point, just because the guy has been knocked out in the first round not only 3 times previously in the UFC, but 3 times in a row. And that attrition is going to catch up with him at some point, particularly as he has now just crossed over his 36th birthday only a couple weeks ago. As he gets older, that attrition is going to catch up with him at some point. Whether or not it happens here remains to be seen, but I do think Bukauskas is going to put forth a greater, more active and strategic effort than what Prachnio has experienced in either of his previous wins against Devin Clark or William Knight. So give me Modestas Bukauskas by unanimous decision. Won't be surprised if he finds the knockout, though. The next fight is Caolán, Loughran, and Jake Hadley. This is a short notice appearance for Hadley, and also him moving up to bantamweight. He has fought exclusively at flyweight in his previous UFC appearances. He enters 10-3 after emerging from Dana White's Contender Series as an undefeated prospect. He was favored to beat Alan Nascimento and lost a pretty thorough outclassing of a unanimous decision in that case. Followed that up with a submission win over Carlos Candelario, and then knocked out Malcolm Gordon, and is now on a 2-fight losing streak at the hands of Cody Durden in a fight I believe he was also favored to win, and Charles Johnson, another fight he was favored to win, in which I picked Johnson as an underdog fighting in his local area of, believe it was St. Louis, and Johnson was able to get, I believe it was a 29-28 unanimous decision upset, in which Hadley, I believe, got knocked down at least once. Conversely, Loughran is 1-1 in the UFC, debuted at UFC Paris last year, really feverishly talked a bunch of smack as an, at the time, 8-0 prospect to not only Taylor Lapalus, his opponent, but also French MMA in general. The crowd let him know about it, and Lapalus pretty thoroughly outclassed him, although that fight, I believe, did end up being a 29-28, so he was able to take at least one round away from Lapalus. I then faded him when he fought Angel Pacheco, recognizing, just deciding to go with the underdog given the small sample set between the two, and he won a pretty commanding 30-27 victory. That was in March of this year at Fight Night Blanchfield Fioro in New Jersey. It's an interesting matchup just because, again, Hadley's taking this on short notice. There's things to like and things to be concerned about. He is technically a little bit bigger than Loughran is, but Loughran just has the build of looking like a more natural bantamweight than I think Hadley does, and you wonder how much Loughran is going to be able to impose his physical presence on Hadley because of that. So I can understand why Loughran is over a 2-1 favorite in this spot. But I do think Hadley has the much more impressive experience overall. And, even though he's underwhelmed in the UFC relative to being a guy that came in as an undefeated prospect, he still has shown moments of solid performance. Less so in going the distance. He still has yet to win a fight by decision in his UFC career, but has proven to be a pretty, I think, well-rounded submission guy. And that's where I think that he can have a bit of an edge here over Loughran. It's worth noting that he ended up in what was the last MMA appearance we've seen from Carlos Candelario. Tatsuro Taira, who is, currently one of the darlings of the division, had to take Candelario to a decision when they fought in May of 2022. And later that year, Hadley was able to get the better of him by submission in the second round. So he is, for whatever you want to say about the success that he has had, there have been spots where he's been more successful than similar young prospects that you would have anticipated would have gotten the better of a fighter like that. Loughran has never been finished. So if this fight does go the distance, I'll be concerned for Hadley. But again, this is probably the highest level opponent that Loughran has faced. It is certainly a step up in competition for Manel Pacheco. Whether or not you want to say Lapilus is bantamweight's a really deep division, so it's tough to gauge where Lapilus is at bantamweight relative to where Hadley maybe would have been sitting at flyweight before this year started. But it's not like Hadley has had an unimpressive loss in the UFC, despite the fact that I believe he was favored in all three of the fights that he did end up losing by decision. Nascimento's proven to be a beast, even though we haven't seen him for a little while. Cody Durden obviously was having a very impressive performance last weekend up until Silva got the equalizing uppercut to turn the tables on that fight completely. Prior to that, Durden was just totally outclassing him. And Johnson's obviously at the height of his UFC run right now, too. So it's not like the guy has a bad loss on his record. I would say the Mitch Raposo fight hasn't necessarily aged gracefully for him. Candelario we haven't seen since Hadley beat him. And Malcolm Gordon's obviously out of the UFC now. So he needs a good win, but he doesn't have a discouraging loss. And the line here is wide enough for a guy like Hadley, who grew up less than a 2-hour drive away from Manchester where this card is taking place, that I do think he's going to pretty firmly have the crowd behind him. And he's got at least enough upside in the submission department if Loughran decides to try to, initiate wrestling here, which based on his average of 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, you have to think he's going to at least try at some point. I don't know if Hadley is going to... I don't trust Hadley to be able to get to the fight to the ground on his terms, but I do think that if this fight does go to the ground, he's going to be able to provide enough resistance where he is maybe able to turn the tables a little bit. And the fact that he's a southpaw against an orthodox fighter like Loughran, I think is going to give him a little bit of turbulence on the feet to deal with. And he does have more experience than Loughran going the distance, despite the fact that he doesn't have as much success. And he's just proven to be a more potent finisher, I think, generally, or at least a more well-rounded finisher than what we've seen from Loughran. Loughran has only ever won by rear naked choke relative to his submission game and hasn't done so since 2020. Hadley, I believe, beat Candelario by rear naked choke. But on Contender Series, he beat Mitch Raposo. No, he beat Mitch Raposo by rear naked choke, sorry. I guess Candelario would have been an arm triangle, if that's right. It was a triangle choke. So he's more versatile submission game than what Loughran is offering for sure. And I think that edge, combined with the fact that he's going to have the crowd on his side and has faced a stiffer level of competition relative to elevating his game, offsets the short notice move up in weight class enough that I think I can feel good about taking a shot on Hadley here, given the plus 200 or greater price tag. So since I put him out at that price, it's dipped below plus 200 a little bit, so some money has come in on Hadley across the books. But Loughran is still sitting out there at a 2-1 favorite. I am still going to go with Hadley, though. I like being able to take an underdog fighting in friendly territory. It's what I did when Charles Johnson fought Jake Hadley, and it worked out. And I think that there are enough spots here for Hadley to make an impression. And I think he's probably feeling some pressure too, which is why he was willing to take this spot. That he needs to recapture some momentum in his career, particularly in his UFC career, if he wants to get the ship righted. And I can't imagine, especially because I would think the UFC wanted to keep Loughran on the card after his opponent pulled out, that Hadley doing the company a favor here, taking this fight, is going to reflect well on his future with the promotion as well, regardless of whether he wins or loses. If he does lose, he'll probably get another shot to kind of salvage himself in some way. But I think this is a good spot for him on short notice to kind of right the ship and fix some of the narratives that have gone awry following his Dana White Contender Series appearance as an undefeated prospect. So I'll say Jake Hadley is the first person to finish Caolán Loughran, that he is able to kind of surprise some people in the first round. And Loughran kind of, gets a little bit more aggressive, trying to put himself back in the fight in the second round, and makes a mistake that Hadley, with his superior experience, is able to capitalize on and find a submission. So give me Jake Hadley to win by second round submission. The featured prelim at UFC 304 is Nathaniel Wood and Daniel Pineda. Wood enters 20-6. His last appearance was at UFC 294, Mokaev versus Volkanovski 2, in which he lost a controversial unanimous decision to Muhammad Naimov, in which Naimov committed several unpenalized fouls between grabbing the fence, multiple groin strikes, and then in the final round, when Wood appeared to have a ground and pound finishing opportunity after Naimov gassed in the third round, as he traditionally has in fights that have nearly gone the distance, Naimov grabbed the glove of Wood to prevent him from finishing the fight through ground and pound, and got away with that as well. Wood was something like a 300 favorite going into that fight, and that was the first fight on the card, so that was a pretty significant parlay killer for a lot of people. I did have Wood in my moonshot, but I didn't feel good enough about playing him at that price to put him in any significant parlays that day. Prior to that, he did fight at Fight Night Aspinall Tybura in the UK last year, in which he got a unanimous decision over Andre Fili that was closer than the unanimous decision would have implied. I think that probably in a neutral environment would have been at least graded a split. Probably could have gone to Wood even in that event, but Fili certainly had an argument for winning the fight, and I think the fact that it happened in England, the crowd made enough of an impression on the judges there that Wood was able to get the unanimous decision. Fili was very, very frustrated and pissed off after that fight. You could see when the judges were reading the result, he thought that he won even in unanimous fashion. Conversely, we haven't seen Pineda in a year. Last time he fought was at Fight Night Kaikara France Albazi, in which he dropped a unanimous decision to Alex Caceres. In that fight, I made Caceres a parlay leg. I believe I barely made profit that night thanks to the Albazi robbery, but I felt very, very... Caceres was my most confident pick of the card because he had significantly better experience and success going the distance than Pineda did, and I just didn't really think much of Pineda's finishing ability at this stage, and that proved to be the correct read. And Pineda still has a 100% finishing rate through 43 MMA appearances, that at least 43, not including the 3 within his last 7 that ended up going down as a no contest. So he has still never won going the distance in his MMA career. The closest he got was a split decision in his third stint with Bellator against Emmanuel Sanchez in 2016. So he is kind of on the last stage of his career at this point. I'm surprised that he keeps getting put into spots as prominent as this. I faded him against Tucker Lutz, and that ended up being not the right read. And I made Tucker Lutz a parlay leg that night. When that was Fight Night Vera Sandhagen in March of last year. But I've never really had a high opinion of Pineda in the time that I've been doing this, in the short time I've gotten to evaluate him. I've thought not as highly of Wood as some other people, but he has grown on me a little bit. I did fade him against Charles Jourdain when he fought him at UFC Paris 2 years ago, and that ended up being the wrong read. It was one of the best performances of Wood's career, frankly, and completely outclassed Air Jourdain. And then I took Feely as an underdog at Fight Night Aspinall Typer last year, and Wood got the better of him there. Finally decided to put some faith behind him, picking his money line at UFC 294, as I alluded to at the top of this, and it didn't really end up going well. I did take his plus 2.5 when he fought Charles Rosa at the first Blaydes Aspinall fight night, and that ended up being the correct read. So that was one time where I hedged on rounds with Wood previously when he had been a significantly wide favorite. I think he was something like a minus 500 favorite against Charles Rosa 2 years ago. Now he finds himself in a similar spot against Daniel Pineda. I can understand why the line is the way that it is, and Wood's obviously very popular among of the UK fighters on this card. I think he's definitely someone that the local crowd has high hopes for. Pineda's still a potent enough finisher, even though I don't have a high opinion of his finishing ability. You can still, just for the style of fight he's going to fight, the potential for a finish here, I think, is enough to dissuade anybody from betting him out at like a 500, 600 price. And the price on Wood has come down gradually over the week, although he's still out in the 400 range. I'd feel good about playing Wood, inside of in the 200 range. But anything at 3-1 or greater, I think, is just too expensive. And so that's currently where this is. So I'm going to be hedging on rounds for this one. I am a little bit worried about Pineda's ability to go the distance, but I think Wood, given his own inability to really find any finishes in his own UFC career, lends itself to Pineda kind of surviving at least into the second half of this fight. He's been knocked out 3 times, but at least one of those was a doctor's stoppage due to a cut that still happened in the second half of the fight. And another one was his loss to Cub Swanson, who I think is a much harder hitter than Nathaniel Wood is. Wood still has yet to find a knockout win in the UFC. He had a run of 3 straight first-round knockouts in Cage Warriors prior to joining the UFC that I think spurred his move into the promotion, and then started his career with 3 submission wins. But he's gone over the 1.5 round mark in every single fight that he's had since following his debut. So given that Pineda in recent contests has exceeded that mark, the Feely fight ended in a no contest, so that one would end up being a push in that case, so it wouldn't count. But if you look at the 6 most recent appearances in the UFC that Pineda has had since 2013, you would see that 5 of those all went over that 1.5 round mark. So I'm going to be nervous about how Pineda holds up in the second round, assuming it makes it out to there. But I think that he would probably beats him up pretty good in the first round and then goes back and tries to make reads about how he can get a finish in the second. But I think Pineda's going to hold out enough that he, at least if he does get finished, it probably doesn't happen until the third round. In all but 2 of Wood's fights, he's seen the third round, and he has gone to decision in 6 straight fights. So I think that this is, he's kind of proven to be much more of a builder than I'm surprised that this is lined at 1.5 rounds, but I think it's because that there's a bit of recognition here about for where Pineda is at this stage of his career. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up getting relined at 2.5 rounds as the week goes on, but it's still at a position where the price on it is basically the same at what it was when I put the pick out. So I do feel really, really good about this pick. I don't know if I'm going to make it a parlay leg just because I hate sweating plus 1.5s. Usually I feel much better about a plus 2.5. Just because that indicates that the general expectation is it's going to go to a decision. And Pineda is facing a pretty significant age gap here towards the end of his career. But again, Wood has just consistently gone to the third round in the UFC. None of his fights have ended in the first round at all. And, he hasn't really, he's only averaging about half a submission attempt per 15 minutes. So I don't know what even though he won his first 3 fights by submission, his rate of attempts has obviously gone significantly down from the first 3 fights he had in the promotion. And he still doesn't have a UFC knockout win. So I think that the finishing potential with Pineda is actually a little bit greater given the fact that Wood has lost by both knockout and submission previously and has been knocked out in the UFC. But even if that does happen, I don't expect it to happen in the first round. I think it'll be later in the fight, even though Pineda is going to, come out and try to tank this, I think. So I do like the plus 1.5 here. We'll see how many options are out there in terms of parlay legs as the week goes on. But this is a pick that even with the slight juice on it, I feel pretty good about. I'm going to say Wood wins this by third round knockout and that he does get his first win in the UFC by knockout, but I think that he's going to probably pour it on Pineda a little bit and style on him in the opening 2 rounds before he finally moves in for the kill in the third. The first fight on the main card at UFC 304 is Arnold Allen against Giga Chikadze. Allen enters 19-3 on a 2-fight losing streak, granted against 2 of the most capable fighters at featherweight right now. Last year in what was, I believe, his second main event, lost a unanimous decision over 5 rounds to Max Holloway, and followed that up with an appearance at UFC 297 this year that resulted in a unanimous decision loss to Movsar Evloev. I believe I had Allen as... I don't know if I had him graded to beat Holloway. I don't think that I did. If I did, I felt not confident enough about it that I opted to just hedge on the rounds, given Holloway was going above 4.5 in pretty much every fight in recent memory for him, Korean Zombie notwithstanding. And that ended up being the case in that one. Against Evloev, I believe I took the Evloev money line, even though it was 2-1. There's people that would argue that Allen did more damage or effective striking to win that fight. I don't necessarily agree. I think Evloev won that in convincing fashion, even though he's obviously got a style that most people aren't necessarily thrilled with. Conversely, Giga Chikadze enters 15-3. His last appearance was at that fight night between Max Holloway and the Korean Zombie, UFC Singapore in last August. He fought Alex Caceres in his first fight in about a year and a half. He was favored to win that one and did by unanimous decision. I'm a little bit biased. I picked Caceres as an underdog, but I thought that fight was closer than the judges' scorecards reflected. I thought Caceres did a lot of really good work in that fight and that it should have at least been a split decision. But Chikadze got rewarded for landing, I think, more effective strikes early on in the fight. But I was surprised at the result of that one, only in the sense that I believe Chikadze got all three 30-27s. I was surprised that the judges didn't even give Caceres one round, given for the entire fight, Chikadze only landed 3 more significant strikes. So it was surprising to me to see not even one round in that one go to Caceres. I think this is a closer... I should say, I think that if Allen fights a complete fight against Chikadze, if he blends all of the martial arts together, and he is the more complete martial artist between these two, which is why he's favored at nearly 2.5 to 1, I think Allen clears this pretty easily. And in the event that he were to fight that complete fight, I might even play him out at 3 to 1 as a moneyline favorite. But the thing is, that was also part of the reason that I thought he might have a path to victory against Max Holloway, and we did not see him attempt to really mix it up further than trading on the feet at all in that fight either. The Qatar fight was kind of a wash just because, Qatar got injured, obviously. The Dan Hooker fight, Dan Hooker was fighting at a weight class he had no business being in. But the Sadiq Youssef fight, him kind of fighting a well-rounded game plan, I think was a big part of the reason that he was able to come back and win that fight after Youssef took the first round away from him. He would be well served to mix things up more than I think he has shown a willingness to do recently. He has the tools to do it and the skills to do it. The question is, will he actually go that route? I'm not convinced that he's going to. And if he does, give a 15-minute standing striking affair to Giga Chikadze, I mean, this is a guy in Chikadze who is going to have significant length advantages, both in terms of reach and in terms of height, particularly the height. He's going to be 4 inches taller than Allen and enjoy a 4-inch reach advantage as well. He does land with greater volume, and he's got the power advantage as well over Arnold Allen. We haven't, as I said, the 2 KOs that Allen has had in the UFC, one of them, Dan Hooker, who already had a bad shin, took even more weight off of it at featherweight and had no business being down at that weight class. And the Qatar fight was an injury. You take those away from him, he had a doctor's stoppage in 2014, and that's when his last knockout took place in his MMA career. So I think Chikadze pretty clearly has the power advantage here. I think he trains out of the better gym with King's MMA, and between all of that, if this just becomes a 15-minute kickboxing match, there's going to be a window for Chikadze to have the more effective performance that results in an upset win here, to the chagrin of the crowd, even though they're obviously going to be pulling for Allen. most of the time that these guys have fought, they've gone the distance. Chikadze's obviously had a few different fights in which he's been able to score knockouts in the UFC. He also lost his Dana White Contender Series appearance by submission, but that was in the final minute of that fight. Otherwise, he's never been submitted in any other fight. He also won the fight after that by armbar, which was the only time he's ever won by submission in his MMA career. But if Chikadze wins this fight by finish, it's probably going to be a knockout. But Allen hasn't really proven to be chinny and has never been knocked out in his MMA career, and went 5 rounds with Max Holloway. I know Holloway kind of dropped him at the bell at the final horn of that fight in the same way that Holloway did against Gaethje, but obviously didn't go out cold. Even though Holloway was kind of calling for a wild swinging war at the end of the same way he did at UFC 300. But I think that if you're worried about finishes in this fight, again, Chikadze might knock him out, but Allen's never been knocked out previously, so it would be surprising if... I'm not saying this is necessarily a step down in competition from Holloway or Evloev, but Chikadze is definitely a less complete MMA fighter, I think, than either of those two. And it would be surprising if Chikadze were the first guy to finish Allen in his MMA career. Conversely, Chikadze lost that Contender Series appearance by submission, but as you get older, one of the things that, over a long-term trend, one of the only things that tends to improve as fighters even get into their declining years is submission defense. So I have to imagine that's only gotten better for Chikadze, particularly training at King's MMA since that submission loss happened all the way back in 2018. And Allen isn't averaging even half a submission attempt per 15 minutes at this point, even though 2 of his first 4 UFC wins were by submission. So I think that because the over on 2.5 rounds here is at the same price as Arnold Allen's money line, I feel more comfortable hedging on rounds and taking the result out of the judges' hands relative to my own success, rather than leaning on Allen when I'm not sure if he's actually going to approach this fight hunting for his most effective route to victory. If I knew that he was going to wrestle and try to take this to the ground and grapple with Chikadze, I'd feel comfortable playing him 3-1. But I just don't have the confidence that he's going to put the fight in where he's most well-suited to win. And given the advantages that Chikadze has, I think that there's a reasonable case, at least before this fight takes place, that Chikadze could really, really give him some problems on the feet. So I'm going to say Allen wins a 29-28 decision in which Chikadze is able to make at least an impression on one of these rounds with striking. But it wouldn't surprise me if Allen really deploys a full mixed martial arts game plan if he ends up getting a 30-27 here, particularly with the crowd's help. So give me Arnold Allen by unanimous decision, but if you're betting this, I would take fight goes the distance as opposed to taking a money line on either of these guys. The next fight is Christian Leroy Duncan and Gregory Rodriguez. Duncan enters 10-1 on the heels of a 2-fight winning streak. He has only won by knockout in the UFC and only won by knockout in his last 5 wins. He debuted at UFC 286 the first time, or no, that was the second time that Leon Edwards beat Kamaru Usman. Potentially causing an injury to Dusko Todorovic, but Todorovic kind of went down with it was an underwhelming debut just because it ended in less than 2 minutes with Todorovic suffering a leg injury. He followed that up as a favorite against Armen Petrosyan in a fight where he arguably won the first round, but really let the fight get away from him against a more experienced kickboxer in Petrosyan, and he just kind of showed signs of being a bit of an immature fighter at that stage, and let what could have been a win for him really just get away by not taking it as seriously. He was kind of showing Petrosyan his ass and stuff at the in the first round, and then from there it just kind of became an embarrassing way for him to lose his undefeated record. The UFC gave him a bounce back spot against Dennis Tiuliulin, and he was able to finish him towards the end of the second round in that one. And we last saw him earlier this year at Fight Night Rosenstrike Gaziv, where he fought Claudio Ribeiro, and Ribeiro really never got anything going effective whatsoever in that fight, and Duncan was really just able to outclass him completely. Conversely, Gregory Rodriguez is 15-5, also on a 2-fight winning streak. We last saw him in, I believe, the main card, if not the co-main event of Fight Night Hermansson versus Pfeiffer, where he knocked out Brad Tavares in the third round. And I believe Tavares has suffered a handful of knockout losses already. So he was not one of the only fighters to knock out Tavares necessarily, but it was a very impressive performance for him. And that was on the heels of knocking out Dennis Tiuliulin in the first round. Prior to that, at UFC 283, he fought a fellow Brazilian in Brazil and got knocked out in a pretty big upset against Bruno Ferreira, who had still been pretty inexperienced at that point. And in the fight prior to that, he had one of the crazier fights of 2022 against Chidi Njokuani, in which he suffered one of the ghastlier cuts you're ever going to see that didn't end up resulting in a fight stoppage. And he was able to come back against Chidi Njokuani in that one and get a knockout in the second round. I've had an interesting experience betting on Rodriguez. The first event I ever graded was Fight Night Makhachev Green, and Rodriguez was the 8th fighter I ever evaluated. And I picked Armen Petrosyan to beat him, and it was an extremely close fight. I think both guys had an argument for winning it, but I was grateful to see Petrosyan because I picked him as an underdog get the split decision win. I turned around at the next event and picked RoboCop as a parlay leg against Julian Marquez, and he had a very, very effective first-round knockout performance in that one. I then faded him against Chidi Njokuani, and although that looked to be the correct move early on in that fight, he showed a lot of resolve to turn it around and come back and get the win in that one. Against Bruno Ferreira, I took the under, and I made that a parlay leg at UFC 283, and I did that as a hedge because I recognized either one of these guys could knock the other one out, and Rodriguez had previously suffered a first-round knockout in his MMA debut, as well as a knockout within the first 3 minutes of his fight on Contender Series against a much lower-level opponent in Jordan Williams. Ferreira ended up knocking him out. I took another under on one of his fights when he fought Tiuliulin. I believe I made that a parlay leg as well at UFC 292, an event I profited very well on last year, and that ended up cashing as well. And I do believe I had him as a parlay leg. Granted, he was something like a 2 or 3-1 favorite against Tavares, but I felt good enough about playing him at that price. So I've had a pretty good run picking Rodriguez, and I haven't gotten to pick him as an underdog yet. The only time I got one of his fights wrong was when he fought Chidi Njokuani. Conversely, I've had some trouble figuring out Leroy Duncan. I picked him as a favorite. I believe made him a parlay leg at Fight Night Vittori Cannonier last year, and that definitely did not go my way. I took the under when he fought Dennis Tiuliulin, and that didn't go my way either. And I believe I played Ribeiro as an underdog against him if I didn't take the under. So I've not had a lot of success with CLD, but I have had a lot of success with RoboCop Rodriguez. And when I look at this fight, we've seen a good, sophisticated, like well-rounded tool set, I think, from Leroy Duncan so far, but the toughest opponent that he faced out of the 4 that he did so far at Petrosian, he played with his food and let it get away from him. I don't believe Ribeiro or Tiuliulin are still in the UFC. It's possible Todorovic is, but we haven't seen Todorovic since March of last year when he lost to Christian Leroy Duncan in what was CLD's UFC debut. So I don't know if he's recovered from his injury yet or not, or if the UFC is going to give him another shot. But this is easily, I think, the toughest opponent that Leroy Duncan has faced. And I don't think the same is necessarily true for RoboCop Rodriguez. So I think that the big advantages in this fight for RoboCop are not only is he going to be the more powerful hitter, the more potent finisher based on what we've seen from these two, even though Leroy Duncan, all of his wins recently have been by knockout. You can say the same for RoboCop. His last 5 wins rather, have all been knockouts, but he also beat Todorovic by decision and arguably beat Petrosian by decision as well. He has only ever lost. He's never lost a unanimous decision in his UFC career, Gregory Rodriguez, in his MMA career, Rodriguez. He's got 2 split decision losses, and he's got more experience going the distance than what Leroy Duncan has as well. So I think between being the more experienced fighter, despite the fact that age doesn't really play into much here, he's more experienced not only at going the distance, but also has more than twice as many UFC appearances as Duncan when you include his appearance on Dana White's Contender Series. Between that and being the more powerful hitter and just having a more established, effective ground game and also 100% takedown defense at this point to resist, if Duncan does try to mix it up here, if things do get hairy for him, I think that Rodriguez is still going to be able to just kind of pressure and keep the fight on his terms. I am worried about Rodriguez's own striking defense relative to the amount of times he's been knocked out. But if he does get knocked out, I would imagine it's going to be on something like a head kick or a knee or some other one of these meme strikes from Duncan, as opposed to the knockout potential from just one punch, which I think is much more favorable to Rodriguez in this case. So I do think that Rodriguez has much, much more upside here, and if this fight were not happening in Manchester, if this were happening outside of England, I think that Rodriguez would probably be the favorite here. But there's enough enthusiasm surrounding Christian Leroy Duncan fighting on home soil that he's getting slotted here as the betting favorite by the market. So I'm taking RoboCop as an underdog. The line's gotten a little bit wider after this fight got announced. Actually, when the fight was initially announced, Rodriguez was a nearly 2-1 favorite, and the line not only totally flipped, but has nearly come back down into a pick'em in several instances during this week. But every time it has, the market has responded by just going back in on Leroy Duncan to the point where Rodriguez comes back down to around the 125 range. So, I hope they keep betting it down further because for all the reasons I just listed, I think there's more upside here with Rodriguez. I'm going to be hoping I finally get a read on a Leroy Duncan fight right. If not, it'll be the 4th time I think that I've screwed it up. But my record picking Rodriguez's fights makes me feel good about taking this guy as an underdog for the first time. So I'm going to say Rodriguez knocks this guy out in the first round. I'll say that Duncan gets a little bit overconfident early, maybe is getting a little bit better in terms of the volume, and Rodriguez just lands a really, really powerful shot that Duncan hasn't really had to feel before, and he finishes him either on the ground. I wouldn't necessarily rule out a submission for Rodriguez, but we haven't seen it yet in the UFC, so I think it's much more likely that he ends up finishing this by ground and pound in the event he gets a knockdown. So I'll say it happens in the first round. It could come later. It wouldn't surprise me if this goes the distance and Rodriguez ends up getting a decision either. But I think regardless of how it happens, it's going to be because Rodriguez capitalizes on overconfidence from Duncan in this spot. So give me RoboCop to get the upset. The next fight is King, the fighter formerly known as Bobby Green, and Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. Green enters 32-15-1. Most recently appeared at UFC 300 fighting Jim Effin Miller and getting a unanimous decision win. I believe it was the rare 29-26 scorecard in which a fighter loses the first round and then gets two 10-8s in the final 10 minutes to get a 29-26. So the rare scorecard of that total that had no point deductions attached. Prior to that, he suffered one of the more brutal late stoppages against Jalen Turner at Fight Night Darus Sarukian. And prior to that, scored arguably the biggest win of his career against Grant Dawson in a fight that Dawson was something like a 4-1 favorite to win, and Bobby Green just came out and crushed him in almost the first 30 seconds. And the fight before that got a very, very late submission over Tony Ferguson, which was his first submission win since his UFC debut in 2013. Conversely, Paddy Pimblett also fought Tony Ferguson in his last appearance. That was at UFC 296, in which his countryman Leon Edwards defended his title against Colby Covington. He very nearly finished Tony Ferguson in the first round, but that fight ended up getting stretched out to a decision, but Paddy made that relatively non-competitive. I think I ended up staying away from that fight, but I might have either hedged on the over, but I know I didn't take Ferguson as an underdog, and I think the line was too wide for me to take a risk on Paddy given how his previous performance had gone, which I did take him as a 2-1 favorite to beat Jared Gordon at UFC 282, and there's a lot of opinions I've heard about that fight. As time has gone on, I've heard people try to make the case that it wasn't as much of a robbery as people claim it to be. That was one of the most brutal robberies since I've been doing this that I've seen. And that fight very, very much confirmed for me why considering promotional angles of fighters is so crucial in evaluating this sport, particularly if you think a fight is going to go to decision. And that is what I expect to happen in this fight. There's a lot of people that are I shouldn't say speculatively, they're confidently picking King Green in this one for reasons that I do understand. Green has I think a pretty considerable volume advantage, a much, much greater wealth of experience and strength of schedule. And despite the fact that he is a guy that fights guard down, is much more sophisticated in terms of defensive striking and protecting himself than Paddy Pimblett has proven to be at this point. Pimblett's striking is still coming together. His most effective realm of fighting is still grappling, but getting to the ground has proven to be another story, and he has not really been efficient with his takedown attempts whatsoever. And the stats actually reflect that Green is much better in that area in terms of getting to the ground on his terms than Pimblett is. Submission game, it's much more in Pimblett's wheelhouse, but Bobby Green hasn't lost by submission since 2009 and has only lost by submission twice across his nearly 50 MMA appearances. And his last loss was from a toe hold. So the first time he lost was a rear naked choke. The second time it was a toe hold, and he hasn't lost by submission since 2009. And as I alluded to earlier in discussing Allen and Chikadze, one of the things that only consistently keeps improving as fighters get into their declining years is submission defense. So I would think that Green has only gotten better with age at defending those attempts, and that if Patty is able to, take his back and get some sort of back triangle rather, that he's still going to be able to effectively fight off rear naked choke attempts and whatnot. Patty needs to get this to the ground. I think that he can get this to the ground. I think he probably will get this to the ground in at least one of the rounds and make this close. I can understand why people think Green is just going to totally outclass him on the feet when the fight is in those spots. But even if if the fight is not definitively going in Green's favor, if Pimblett is at least making enough of an impression in one or two moments during a round where the crowd is reacting very strongly towards him as opposed to what Green is doing, there's going to be a reasonable argument for Pimblett to get a robbery. The particularly interesting thing that I noticed in the run-up to the Jared Gordon fight, and what partially made me feel confident in picking Patty, was that there was way too much media investment, both from the UFC and from other outlets such as Barstool Sports, in the interest of Patty winning that fight. I believe there was a interview that Patty did directly with Dana White during that week in which they went out of their way to kind of slander Ariel Helwani. And so Pimblett had kind of been really showcased as this company guy going into that fight. And and he had been doing a ton of work with Barstool Sports at that point. And, the other, I can't remember. I don't think Molly McCann fought on that card too. But it's easy to forget how beloved Patty was prior to that result and that entire fight week. The narrative started changing on Patty as those, he started kind of to, become more of a company guy, I think, during that week. And then once the result was definitively the unanimous decision Patty robbery, the narrative on what he was and could be as a fighter just completely shifted. And he's now gone from being one of the most beloved up-and-comers in the UFC to being almost a notoriously hated figure among fight fans outside of the UK. But this fight is happening in the UK, and Patty is still very much a company guy based on the matchmaking that he's got, and I think that there's still too much invested in his future as a fighter to where they have wanted to prop him up and put him in spots that he can win to improve his image. I believe this fight, the line is flipped. It hasn't quite flipped yet, but every time it gets close to it did flip at one point earlier this week, but it immediately went back to Green being the favorite. But every time it's gotten close, the King Green bettors have just immediately gone back into the wheelhouse of wanting to put more money on him and double or triple down because of the line movement. So this fight is a bona fide pick'em, and I mean, I have it graded as such. I've got a very, very, very slim grade on Bobby Green. If this fight were not happening in the UK, if it weren't happening in Manchester, I would feel much, much more confident in picking Green than I do at the moment. But because Paddy's never been knocked out and because Green hasn't lost by submission in 15 years, I feel pretty good about this fight going the distance. And I think this is, and I said it when this fight got announced. I got, Marcus Williams, the Nubian bookstore owner, and one of the most beloved figures on MMA betting Twitter, when he tweeted about this fight getting announced and expressed his enthusiasm for King at the time, Bobby Green, winning this fight, I very quickly replied saying, you're going to want to hedge on fight goes the distance and taking your money out of the judge's hands. I knew before I even looked at the numbers that was how I was going to want to play this. And I'm surprised that the over is only at around minus 170. It was minus 175 when I put the pick out. And I think that the people expecting Green to get a knockout here are a little bit too ambitious with that. And I think that the people that are confident in picking Green are just being too naive relative to the history we've already seen in terms of favoritism to Paddy in these environments. If this fight goes the distance, it's going to have to be Green, no doubt, dominating the striking for all 15 minutes. And I don't think that Paddy is going to just let him do that. And I don't think the crowd is going to let him do it either. And if there's even a sliver of an argument for Paddy winning 10 of these 15 minutes, this fight has greasy split written all over it. So give me the plus 2.5 rounds. I will say Bobby Green wins a razor close split decision here, but I expect fans to be frustrated with the result of this fight regardless of what happens, and I don't really think that there's anything that Paddy can do to improve his image outside of the UK, regardless, unless he just comes out and absolutely, whomps Bobby Green. Which I don't necessarily expect to happen given we haven't seen Paddy win by KO since his UFC debut against Luigi Vendramini. This is the most credible threat he's faced so far in his MMA career, and even though the recent attrition for Green is concerning, there's still enough risk here for Paddy on the feet based on what we saw in the Jared Gordon fight and how washed we know Tony Ferguson is, that this I think is going to be a much closer fight than people are expecting, even though the betting line indicates that it's a pick'em. Both sides betting their guy are very confident that their fighter is going to win. And I think that it's just a much closer fight than either side is willing to admit, which is reflected in how the market is shaped in the lead up to it. So give me the safer result, which I think is the plus 2.5 rounds, and I'll be grinning like a clown for that last 2.5 minutes of that fight if it is razor close and I don't have to worry about what the judges are going to say. The co-main event at UFC 304 is Tom Aspinall and Curtis Blaydes fighting for the interim heavyweight title, what could prove to be the undisputed heavyweight title, depending on how certain court proceedings go for the other supposedly undisputed champion for the rest of the year. Aspinall enters with a record of 14-3, is on a 2-fight winning streak. His only loss in the UFC was the first time that he fought Curtis Blaydes 2 years ago, in which he suffered a devastating knee injury that many were worried about how that would have an effect on his otherworldly athleticism for a UFC MMA heavyweight. He bounced back in resounding fashion against Marcin Tybura last year at a Fight Night event he was headlining in the UK. He then followed that up with a resounding knockout win against a nuclear hitter in Sergey Pavlovich within the first 90 seconds at UFC 295. Another event in which his title fight was the co-main event relative to Pereira Prohaska 1. Curtis Blaydes, conversely, also fought Sergey Pavlovich last year and was unable to initiate any takedowns. It got knocked out in the first round of that fight. That was in the first fight following his win over Tom Aspinall at Fight Night Blaydes Aspinall in July of 2022. He then followed that up at UFC 299 in a fight that had basically served as a pick'em all week with a second-round knockout of Jailton Almeida, a fight in which I picked Almeida to win. Almeida won the first round unanimously and then just got way too dedicated to a single leg entry that he had on Blaydes early in the second round. And, the lowest... long-term speaking, the lowest area of likely finishes in the cage is when a fight is up against the fence, and you saw a very rare instance of a fight ending from the clinch when, while too dedicated to holding onto the leg, Blaydes was just able to rain down hammer fists, which, interestingly enough, for a guy that gets praised so much for his ground game, for, his ability to blend wrestling with ground and pound. He's always been more of a devastating elbows guy on the ground rather than someone that's ever really deployed hammer fists, which are probably the second most effective form of ground strikes you can land other than elbows. But we saw a storm of hammer fists at UFC 299, and that ended up putting Almeida out pretty bad. And even though there were chin concerns for Almeida already, I don't think that most people were picking the fight to end in that fashion. And it was pretty devastating for people that picked Almeida thinking that he was going to be able to challenge Blaydes in a way that he had typically been much more comfortable operating in almost every fight he's had at heavyweight. It was a bizarre result, and one that I don't think a lot of people that bet Blaydes are being very genuine about relative to what happened. I think a lot of them got bailed out, whereas most of them are acting like, oh, they saw it coming the whole time. I don't think any of them saw Almeida controlling Blaydes for 4.5 minutes in a way that made a unanimous impression on the judges in the first round. So I think if you're being honest about that, you understand why the current line on his rematch with Aspinall is where it is. I picked Tom Aspinall when he was closer to like a minus 165 favorite the first time that he fought Curtis Blaydes, and that was, I believe, the week after UFC Long Island when Ortega had his fight against Yair Rodriguez cut short by injury. So there were two back-to-back injury losses in the main event. The Aspinall one was obviously much more devastating and much more of an unforced injury. But I've spoken about how that Long Island fight night was one of the worst betting events I've had doing this, and how that final result in which I had taken Ortega as the favorite and he lost in the fashion that he did just kind of caused me to throw back my head and laugh. This fight night between Blaydes and Aspinall, I had already gone out after, I believe, Chris Curtis lost to Jack Hermanson, which killed all of my action that night. So I was really just watching the main event, hoping that Aspinall could salvage the evening against Curtis Blaydes, or not necessarily salvage the evening, but just that, my last pick of the night would be correct. And, to see a second main event in a row end in that fashion was pretty devastating. And I remember thinking, after Aspinall won the title, if he does ever fight Blaydes again, there's no way that we're going to get that fight lined at the same price. There's just no way. And that ended up proving to be correct. Now, when Aspinall came back against Tybura last year, I did not like how wide the line was. And I might have even had Tybura. I've always had very fond grades on Tybura, regardless of his opponent. And because of the ring rust and that Aspinall had, there's a possibility I may have had Tybura graded to win, but there's no way I was going to play that in a million years. But because I did think Tybura was going to offer some resistance and we didn't know where Aspinall's athleticism was, I decided to get cheeky. And as I alluded to when I talked about that fight night event earlier in the show, I had something like 5 or 6 underdog picks that night, and one of the plus odds picks I had was the plus 1.5 rounds on Tybura Aspinall, that Aspinall was going to kind of ease himself back in, given he hadn't fought in a while and was coming off that devastated knee injury. I thought he was going to be a little bit more tentative, and Tybura was, kind of someone who would prefer to get into the later rounds, and then Aspinall was probably going to get a finish later in the second round as he got his footing back under him and got more comfortable. And then the fight started. And this is one of those, if you've done this long enough, you have your moments as a capper where as soon as a fight begins, you just get a bad feeling like this isn't going to go well. The most recent example I can remember is when I picked Sadiq Yusuff to beat Diego Lopez, and I remember just seeing the countenance on Lopez's face right before the fight started and thinking, oh, he's going to come out and really try to just take this dude's head off. And Yusuff just does not look like he's prepared for what's coming his way. There's just some moments where you can just read into stuff that's going to happen before it happens, even if you're on the other side of it the whole way going in. As soon as that fight with Aspinall started, the speed advantage was incredibly evident. And because he had the speed advantage, there was no reason to believe that he had lost any power. And then it dawned on me that this is a guy who's only seen the second round once, and it was when he was somewhat kind of playing with his food against Andrei Arlovsky in what was at the time only his third UFC fight. And then Aspinall just absolutely steamrolled Tybura. And I remember thinking at that point, okay, this is a guy who hasn't really been correctly knocked or outright knocked out in his MMA career, even though the Blaydes fight was technically a first round TKO loss. But until otherwise, there's no reason to doubt that this guy's just going to hit the under on every fight that he's in. He's just too much of a swarming presence at heavyweight, and he knows it. The guy's a freak athlete compared to an NFL defensive end in terms of what he's presenting at 6'5" and, getting up near the heavyweight limit. There is not another athlete at this size in MMA that has the speed that this guy does in the striking and just in the ability to deploy a well-rounded skill set. The guy is an absolute animal. Blaydes has wrestling, and he may even have a wrestling advantage. But again, if you're talking about this in the context of it being a striker-grappler matchup, and Aspinall is much more sophisticated than just writing him off as a striker. But given the historically great volume that he puts out at this weight class at the speed that he does, it would be almost unsuiting of him to not fight into that fight style every time when he's able to just run over guys in the way that he is, unless he has a very, very significant wrestling advantage against his opponent in which he can deploy, and his opponent is offering some sort of other advantages back to him, which was exactly what the case was against Volkov, and why he was able to go then find a submission in the first round a fight where the under 1.5 was at plus odds, and I was able to cash on that in what was the third event I ever did analysis for, and what kind of spurred me into doing this in the capacity that I'm doing it right now, if I'm being totally honest. I don't see any reason why Aspinall isn't going to do what he's done in all of his other UFC fights. I think that he's just going to run over Blaydes. First round knockout. It's possible that Blaydes is able to get some sort of takedown and, put the fight on the ground. But even if he does, I don't think that he's going to be able to hold Aspinall down in a way that, he's just going to be able to do one of his lay and prays where he's able to drag the fight out into the later rounds. And even if he does end the round on top in the first round, I don't expect him to have landed a significant enough level of offense to where Aspinall isn't just going to be able to come out and run him over at the beginning of the second round. So I've been pretty, I don't like using the phrase as a bettor that I'm due, because I think that's disingenuous to making reads, and that that can be a very dangerous mindset to get behind if you're on a losing streak and you're already losing money. But the trend of heavyweight fights ending in the first half is pretty well established. And granted, this is a 5-round fight, so it's technically scheduled for 5 rounds. So it's not technically you're not, if you're picking the under 1.5, you're not getting the first full half of the fight in the way that you would if you were taking an under 2.5 for a 5-round fight. But the lion's share of heavyweight fights are supposed to end in the first round, and only one of Aspinall's hasn't. And it was against an Arlovsky in his 40s that he might have been able to finish in the first round, even if he had just gotten a little bit more serious, and did end up finishing within the first 90 seconds of the following round. Aspinall's just too much of a freak. I mean, John Jones is somewhat ducking this guy. Like, the division is in the fractured state that it is, not only because John Jones is holding out for that fight against Miocic, but because I think he recognizes how much of a threat Aspinall poses to him, given the stage of careers that both of them are at. I don't know who is going to be able to beat this guy. It might have been Francis Ngannou. He's not in the UFC anymore, and he's taken his licks outside of the sport since he's left. We may never see John Jones fight this guy, period. The guy that was presumably the most credible threat to beat him got nuked when Aspinall won the interim title last November. It's going to be a long time before we get a reasonable price on Aspinall, I think. But for some reason, the unders in his fights are still in the realm of relatively light juice. I don't know how you can pass up taking the under in this case, unless you're convinced that Blaydes is going to have the more successful game plan. And in that case, you should just be betting Blaydes as an underdog. Tom Aspinall by first round knockout. I think he finishes Blaydes possibly even faster than Francis Ngannou did when they fought in 2018. But I expect Aspinall to have his revenge, and for him to really, really establish himself as the pride of all the English fighters right now, even more so than Leon Edwards. And really the future of this division, especially as John Jones appears to be on his way out, for better or worse. I would love to see the two of them fight. I, after looking at it, might even take John Jones under those circumstances, just because that's one of, if not the GOAT. But it's going to be very, very hard, I think, after this performance on on Saturday night for anybody to doubt that the best heavyweight, active heavyweight in the world right now, and one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the sport is Thomas Aspinall, Thomas Aspinall, da 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 da. Tommy Aspinall, Tommy Aspinall, da 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 da. First round knockout. And now we come to the main event. Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad, the rematch. Edwards enters 22-3. Last fought at UFC 296, where he defeated Colby Covington in resounding fashion, in a fight that he probably should have been lined a little bit wider to win than he was. I did have him graded to win ever so slightly, but decided that just given the history of decisions between these guys, that hedging on rounds was going to be the safer bet. That ended up proving to be correct, even though Edwards made that fight relatively non-competitive. But Covington was able to have some surprising success later in the fight that I think plays into why this current fight could get interesting. Conversely, we haven't seen Belal Muhammad, who enters 23-3 since May of last year at UFC 288, when he defeated Gilbert Burns in what I believe was the co-main event of that pay-per-view. Yes, it was. And granted, Burns took that fight, I believe, on a relatively quick turnaround, if not short notice, and possibly had an injury. Definitely got injured over the course of that fight to where he was compromised in a way that Muhammad was able to take advantage of. But it was still the most impressive performance of Muhammad's career, which I believe you can really say has been the case for his last three fights. He was an underdog in the Vicente Luque fight, a fight that I barely had him graded to win, but decided to hedge on rounds instead because that was available at plus odds, and that ended up proving to be the correct call. Couldn't have gone wrong with an underdog pick either way in that case, but decided to go with something I thought was a little bit safer and take it out of the judges' hands. As I alluded to on the last episode of the show, there's not many instances anymore where I've got an underdog graded to win and I'm going to opt to hedge on rounds. So that was the time I got rewarded for doing it earlier in my career, but I've learned since to just, not err on the side of caution and go with, the underdog if you're confident in your process long term that it's going to hit. I kept going to the well for Belal overs against Sean Brady, and that was a very surprising result at UFC 280. I thought when I don't think Brady had been knocked out previously or even finished previously in his MMA career at that point. In fact, he was still undefeated at the time. I would imagine there were I can't remember if he was the underdog or not, but that was certainly the most impressive performance of Muhammad's career up to that point. And the fact that he was able to do it without any takedowns, that he was able to just completely outclass Brady in the striking, I think really shocked a lot of people. And, he had there was the narrative going against him that, he, had only had 2 finishes and 1 knockout across a litany of UFC appearances up to that point. So that was a good kind of turn the narrative around for him moment at UFC 280 in October of 2022. And then the Gilbert Burns performance, even with the injury stuff surrounding Burns, I mean, that guy is still somebody that gave Khamzat Chimaev his toughest test of his career up to that point and very nearly won that fight. And Muhammad was still able to beat him in more dominant fashion than what Chimaev showed, and do it without landing any takedowns. So we're seeing the best of Belal Muhammad right now, even as he enters, he turned 36 earlier this month. So he is technically, at least over a long-term sample, in the declining, what you would think are the declining age of his career compared to Edwards still being in his prime. but he's one of these guys that has atypically been able to make improvements in areas you don't typically see improvements in based on the results in these years that are supposed to be declining years. And I think that speaks to, what his fighting style has been. He did get knocked out by Vicente Luque in the first round the first time that they fought. But he really hasn't suffered much attrition since then. The worst thing that you can arguably say that has happened to him in any of his, host of appearances since has been the eye poke he suffered against Leon Edwards in a fight that a lot of people, particularly those betting Edwards this week, like to point to as, the reason that Edwards is going to win or dominate this rematch. But I think you would be naive to not acknowledge that not only the improvements that Muhammad has made since that fight, but I think that Edwards is still much more of, even as he's in his prime years, much more of a finished product that he was in that fight, that hasn't necessarily made as many impressive improvements to his game as what Muhammad has demonstrated in his most recent appearances. I do think that Muhammad is the more well-rounded fighter here, even though this is a matchup of two very, very complete mixed martial artists. I wish this fight wasn't happening in the UK, but just because it's Leon Edwards, the UFC, I guess, wants to squeeze this lemon for all it's worth while it's still ripe, so to speak. I think that's why they gave him the rematch against Usman in the UK at UFC 286. I think it's also why they let him hold out on defending his belt against somebody other than Usman until Colby Covington was ready. And there were open narratives going into that fight that Colby was kind of already washed, and in many ways those were proven to be correct by the time the two of them finally fought. And I've been pretty disappointed overall with how inactive of a champion that Edwards has been since he did win the title on what many people would call a fluke. I don't want to go that far in saying that, but I think you would be naive to not acknowledge that he won that fight on the equivalent of a Hail Mary, a fight that he was... he won the first round in undisputedly, finally broke that 100% takedown defense mark of Kamaru Usman's and took the back and was able to threaten at least one submission attempt, but otherwise got totally out-wrestled and just stage frozen for the remaining minutes of the fight until that head kick miraculously landed in the final minute of the fifth round. By that point, Usman was a minus 20,000 favorite to win that fight. A lot of people claim the altitude at UFC 278 had something to do with Edwards' performance and that he was going to do better in the UK as a result. I don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. I also found it very surprising that Edwards did get penalized for a fence grab by Herb Dean in that fight in the UK. And that's something that I hold against fighters when they do get penalized for fouls. In at least one fight, you have to wonder if they're going to display that tendency again in a way that costs them. I think the most brilliant example of that I can remember, and it doesn't happen often in terms of seeing a foul occur in one fight and then you see the foul come back again in other fights in a way that ends up costing them, but the most resounding example of that I can remember from the early time that I was doing this was when Alex Da Silva, I believe his name was, fought Joe Solecki. And that fight that Silva otherwise would have maybe had an argument to win against Solecki ended up being a decision in Solecki's favor because Da Silva committed... I'm not sure if it was a fence grab, but he committed some sort of foul in that fight that ended up resulting in a point deduction. Another example I can think of is when oh gosh, I'm forgetting what his name is, but it was when, oh man, this is going to drive me nuts. Not Muhammad Naimov, but one of the other Tajikistan fighters. Um, I think it was Moin Gafarov. Yeah, it was Moin Gafarov when he fought John Castaneda. Gafarov had shown a tendency for fouling earlier in his career too, and that he got penalized for a very blatant headbutt against John Castaneda that ended up making what could have been a closer fight an outright unanimous decision for Castaneda. So, and kind of, dispiriting him and ruining his chances. So there's at least a precedent for Edwards being penalized for fouls in fights that happen in the UK that I don't think you can discredit here. And the fact that it's fence grabbing, you have to imagine that Belal is going to, want to deploy and take this fight to the ground here at some point. You just wonder if Leon is going to try to make the most of the fence in terms of keeping himself upright. And, if Herb Dean is officiating this fight again, if he's, going to be comfortable letting Leon get away with that. Now, another thing that I alluded to at the top of this breakdown that I've seen a few other people point out this week that I hadn't even necessarily considered when I did my raw grading for this, is that whether it was his foot taking off the gas or just, trying to conserve himself, Edwards did slow down at the end of the Covington fight to the point that Covington was able to kind of come back, and I don't think he was ever really in a position to get finished, but you would have expected a stronger performance from a guy that has as much experience going the distance as Edwards does down the stretch of a fight. He did kind of gas himself a little bit in a way that Covington was able to come back and make an impression in the later part of the fight to get, I believe, at least one of the rounds. So I do think that merits concern opposite someone like Belal, who has lost unanimous decisions in his MMA career, in two of which in the UFC, but has otherwise been very, very consistently successful in fights that have gone the distance, and he has more experience doing so than Edwards, even though Edwards would have an advantage over almost any other fighter relative to experience going the distance in the UFC, not just at welterweight. I said I enjoy the Shillen and Duffy show put out by Sherdog, and I felt pretty vindicated that both of those guys were taking Muhammad in the upset, despite the fact that this fight is happening in the UK and that the boo birds are going to be out for Muhammad and the crowd is going to be all the way out of his favor and trying to carry Leon to a title defense here. But given everything I just talked about, and I like the way that they described Muhammad, both Keith Shillen and Ben Duffy, in that, the guy has really proven to be a builder that might even be most effective in 5-round fights for what his style is. I would hesitate to compare him to Merab, but the guy has incredible cardio for the way that he typically is shown to prefer to fight, and he's definitely got a similar amount of pressure relative to fight style. Edwards is definitely the more technical striker between the two, but Belal is going to be pressuring and possibly even out-voluming Edwards in a way that I think Edwards is probably going to make a better impression on the striking early in the fight. But as the fight goes on and Muhammad is able to make reads and adjust and possibly start to chip away at the takedown defense of Edwards, I mean, Muhammad's just going to keep coming unless he gets put out by something like a head kick from Edwards, which would be, other than the Usman fight, that would be the only he's had 3 knockouts in the UFC, including the Usman fight, but the last one before the Usman fight happened in the final minute of the 3rd round of his fight with Peter Sabata in 2018. Prior to that, he had a 8-second knockout against Seth Baczynski in his second fight in 2015. So you're really having to go to the well here to point out when the potential finishing strikes have come through for Edwards. I think that Edwards is probably going to end up winning the first 2 rounds, but that Muhammad is going to fight back and build in a way that Edwards is at least getting a little bit tired come the 5th round, and then we have an even fight going into the 5th. Either that or we get a 1-1, 1-1 situation where the fight, they're both kind of, it's just close the whole time, and both of them are just kind of edging it out until we get to the 5th round. And both of them have pretty similar experience or success in final rounds in their careers. But I think Muhammad's just a little bit better experience and more well-roundedness and cardio relative to fight style is what gets him over the finish line and gets him a razor close decision here. I feel very, very good about this fight going the distance, and if I were grading Edwards to win here, I would very, very easily just hedge on the over at 4.5 rounds, as I have in all 3 of the fights that I've evaluated for Edwards and cashed successfully. But, and, you know, in at least, and I've done the same thing in terms of hedging on rounds in 2 of Muhammad's 3 performances, but I've got Edwards ever so slightly graded as the underdog here to win. And the last time I had him graded under those circumstances against Vicente Luque, he did get it done. And I think that he can get it done again here in spite of the fact that he's going to be fighting in very unfriendly territory. I think that if he does get Edwards down, he is going to be able to hold him down there and keep the fight on his terms in a way that there's not really going to be a case to be made for Edwards winning those rounds. And I think that if he can do that for 3 of the 5, he's going to get a decision here that can't really be disputed by the fans, that people can't say was a bad decision, one that just leaves more of a bad taste in the mouths of the United Kingdom faithful and the Manchester fans at 6 a.m. in the morning by the time this fight card ends. So give me Belal Muhammad to become the new welterweight champion. It'll be a resounding victory for the city of Chicago, particularly after Curtis Blaydes losing in the previous fight. It'll be an enormous moment for Palestine, obviously. And I think for all the hatred that this guy gets in terms of a boring fighting style, it's going to be one of the best moments of the year in the sport if it happens, given how that first fight Muhammad had with Edwards went and all the vitriol surrounding him. To become the champion in that environment against such insurmountable odds is going to be something that's really, really special to witness if it happens. So I'm going to be taking Belal Muhammad to win as a more than 2-1 underdog. I'm surprised the line is getting a little bit wider. I would think that it maybe gets narrower as the fight gets closer, but you know, the UK loves their own, and I don't expect the money to stop coming in on Leon, but I'm surprised at how many other sharp bettors I've been seeing, or at least just people following the sport that I've seen picking Belal this week in spite of the fact that he's fighting in such an environment. And it makes me think that this line should be much closer than it is, and that there's just a lot of English UK favoritism in play here relative to their champion. So give me Belal Muhammad to pull off one of the upsets in the year across any title fight. That's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 304. We'll tally all the time, but I do think I'm optimistic I kept this under 3 hours. If I didn't, I apologize, but I did say I was hoping to do that at the top of the show. I think outside of the co-main events, I did a pretty good job of keeping every breakdown at around 10 minutes or less. I went a little bit longer than I expected to in some of the fights where I hedged, but in any event, I'm very grateful to you all for tuning in for this long. Let me just remind you one more time, please like, subscribe, and share on Twitter as well as YouTube when you have a moment. I'd be incredibly grateful for that. The platform has grown in, much faster than I anticipated over the last year, and I'm very grateful for that, and I'm trying to I don't want to get greedy with expectations. I'm still trying to just be consistent and happy with the success that's come along. Absolutely have crushed it on pay-per-views this year. I think last time I checked, I know I'm up something like 120 units since UFC 290 last year, which is a little bit over a year ago now. But yeah, at this point, I'm this year on pay-per-views, I'm up 94 units. So I'm hoping to keep that. That's where I like I said, I am in the hole this year and trying to dig myself out of it. I was able to do that in pretty resounding fashion around this time last year, a year ago, when I was in an even deeper hole. Haven't had an outright winning event on a fight night yet this year, but I've been able to save a lot of face with these pay-per-view performances at UFC 298, at UFC 301, and most recently at UFC 303. So I'm hoping to keep the good momentum going. I've had a pretty good read on a lot of these fights, and I think it has a lot of it to do with fighters that have a larger sample size performing on these pay-per-view cards. So I'm encouraged that, I think I picked 4 underdogs on this card, Elliott, Hadley, RoboCop, and Belal. And given my record of betting underdogs lifetime, I'm hopeful at least 2 of those 4 are going to hit, and that the favorites that I have picked across the 8 other fights, whether it's hedging on rounds or just taking money lines, that a majority of those are going to hit as well, to where I'm going to be able to get some profit on this event. So we'll see what happens, but we will be back for UFC 305 in a handful of weeks here, which is going to feature one of the most brilliant fighters I've evaluated since I started doing this, and someone that I've been on the train for from the very beginning, Mr. Dricus du Plessis, who, surprise, surprise, is an underdog once again against the iconic Israel Adesanya. So that's going to be quite a main event. I look forward to evaluating that one, as well as the other fights that are going to gradually get put onto that card on August 17th in a handful of weeks here. And I'll tell you one more thing for those of you that enjoy my content enough to get to the end of this. I've toyed with the idea of trying to do YouTube shorts to try to get some more consistent video content on this channel, as I want to to not only give the audience a more digestible video format of breakdowns, but also to kind of get back into doing video content on weeks that have not been pay-per-view weeks. I'm thinking about maybe doing that starting this week, now that I've gotten the big show out of the way. So, I might try to get some YouTube shorts. As I'm recording this at the end of Tuesday night, I might try to get some YouTube shorts uploaded for tomorrow concerning some of the fights on this card, and then possibly going up Thursday as well. I know the shelf life on those isn't going to be great. I would have wanted to get them out earlier in the week, but I had to do this bigger show that took almost 3 hours to record. But I do think that these, sort of YouTube short minute-long breakdowns are going to be the way for me to kind of work my way back into doing video content for some of these smaller cards going forward. So you can look out for that from me. And if you have stuck around to this point, I'm very grateful for that. And like I've been saying from the jump, I'm never going to ask for your money. And you know, this is going to be a free content platform for as long as I'm alive. So, and keep doing this. So thank you very much for being a MMA Rax loyalist, and good luck with all of your own bets and angles this week. And I look forward to seeing you back for the RAXPOD for UFC 305, possibly on the channel a little bit sooner than that. Take care, folks.